Between 1817 and 1821, the Bell family of Adams, Tennessee, endured what historians call America's most documented supernatural haunting. This is not folklore. This is congressional testimony. The entity tormented them for 4 years, threw furniture, pulled hair, spoke in multiple voices. And when it finally killed John Bell, the whole town watched it happen. Some of those witnesses lived into the 1900s. They never changed their stories. Tonight we're going through the entire Bell witch case. What really happened in that farmhouse? Who had motive to destroy John Bell? And the one detail that every ghost story leaves out, the neighbor who knew too much. You probably know this story, or you think you do. The Bell Witch is American ghost story royalty. It's got everything you want in a good haunting: flying objects, disembodied voices, physical attacks, mysterious lights. Even Andrew Jackson supposedly visited the farm and left terrified after one night. But here's what nobody talks about when they tell this story. The Bell Witch didn't haunt random people. It had very specific targets. It wanted to kill John Bell, and it wanted to prevent his daughter Betsy from marrying Joshua Gardner. Those aren't random supernatural whims. Those are human motivations. John Bell moved his family to the Red River bottomlands of Robertson County, Tennessee in 1804. Good farming country, rich soil, but Bell wasn't just a farmer, he was a land speculator. He bought property cheap from families who couldn't make their payments. He foreclosed on mortgages. He accumulated over 300 acres while his neighbors struggled to keep 40. The community respected him. But respect and love are different things. Bell served as a church elder at Red River Baptist Church. He made the rules about who could join, who could marry, who could be buried in the church cemetery. In a frontier community where the church was the only social institution, John Bell controlled people's lives. And then there was the Kate Batts situation. Kate Batts was Bell's neighbor, a widow trying to hold onto her dead husband's farm. In 1817, she accused John Bell of cheating her in a land deal. The details are murky, but the result was clear. Bell ended up with a piece of Batts' property, and Batts ended up bitter. She made threats, public ones. She told people at the general store that John Bell would pay for what he'd done to her family. She said she'd see him in hell before she'd let him steal another acre. Now, this is where the story gets interesting. Because 3 months after Kate Batts made those threats, the Bell Witch appeared. The haunting started small. August 1817. Strange knocking sounds in the walls of the Bell farmhouse, scratching like rats in the timber. John Bell figured it was animals. Had his sons check the foundation, the roof, the cellar, nothing. Then the sounds got louder, chains dragging across the floor upstairs, footsteps in empty rooms. The Bell family would gather in the main room after supper and something would start throwing furniture. But here's the detail that should bother you. The entity never attacked randomly. It had a pattern. John Bell got the worst of it. The thing would slap him across the face during church services. It would follow him to town and embarrass him in front of neighbors. It yanked his boots off while he was trying to work in the fields. His daughter Betsy got targeted too, but differently. The entity would pull her hair, pinch her arms, throw her around the room, but it never seriously hurt her. It was trying to control her, not kill her. The other children, mostly left alone. Bell's wife Lucy. Occasional harassment, but nothing like what John and Betsy endured. You'd think someone would have noticed the pattern. But when you're living through chaos, patterns are hard to see. By 1818, the entity was talking. Multiple voices. Men's voices, women's voices, children's voices. It claimed to be the spirit of Kate Batts, old Kate's witch, it called itself. It knew things about the Bell family that no outsider should have known. Private conversations, family secrets, business dealings. The entity told visitors exactly what John Bell had done to acquire his land. It described his foreclosure practices in detail. It accused him of cheating widows and taking advantage of families in debt. Now, you might think this sounds like supernatural justice, the ghost of the wronged seeking revenge. But supernatural entities don't usually have such specific knowledge of legal documents and property transfers. The Bell Witch became a tourist attraction. People traveled from Nashville, from Murfreesboro, from as far away as Kentucky to witness the haunting. The Bell family couldn't keep them away. Dozens of visitors every week, camping on their property, demanding to see the ghost perform. And the entity always performed. It would speak to visitors by name. It would tell them things about their own lives that it couldn't possibly know. It would make predictions about their futures that often came true. But here's what nobody asked. How did a supernatural entity know so much about living people? How did it gather information about visitors before they arrived? How did it make accurate predictions about future events? The entity's knowledge wasn't supernatural, it was social. It knew things that any well-connected person in Robertson County would know. It repeated gossip, business rumors, family scandals. It had access to the same information network that any long-time resident would have. And its predictions, they weren't prophecy. They were plans. The Bell Witch didn't predict that Betsy Bell would break her engagement to Joshua Gardner. It forced her to break the engagement. It tormented her every time Gardner visited. It made their relationship impossible to continue. The entity didn't predict John Bell's death. It caused John Bell's death. December 20, 1820. John Bell collapsed in his fields. His family found him convulsing, unable to speak. They carried him to the farmhouse, put him to bed. The doctor couldn't identify what was wrong with him. The Bell Witch visited his sick room. It told the family that it had given John Bell something from a vial it had found in the medicine cabinet, something that would cure him of his greed permanently. When family members checked the medicine cabinet, they found a dark vial they didn't recognize. They tried to give some to the cat. The cat died instantly. John Bell died the next morning. The Bell Witch attended his funeral. It sang drinking songs during the burial service. It told mourners that it was glad the old man was finally in the ground where he belonged. After John Bell's death, the Bell Witch announced it was leaving. It had accomplished what it came to do. It promised to return in 7 years to visit John Bell's descendants. Some say it kept that promise. Others say it never really left. But here's what the ghost story never mentions. After John Bell died, the property disputes stopped. The foreclosures stopped. Kate Batts kept her remaining land. The families who had lost property to John Bell's business practices found themselves dealing with his much more reasonable son. The Bell Witch solved problems that the legal system couldn't touch. It punished behavior that was technically legal but morally wrong. It protected people who had no other protection. That doesn't sound like a supernatural haunting. That sounds like frontier justice carried out by someone who understood the community's power structures and knew how to manipulate them. Someone who had motive to destroy John Bell. Someone who had access to information about his business dealings. Someone who could move freely around Robertson County without suspicion. Someone who had threatened John Bell publicly and then watched him die exactly as promised. The question isn't whether the Bell Witch was real. The question is who was behind the mask. John Bell owned 320 acres of rich bottomland along the Red River in Robertson County, Tennessee. Good soil, good water, good neighbors mostly. The kind of place where a man could build something lasting if he worked hard and kept his mouth shut about other people's business. But John Bell had never been good at keeping his mouth shut. By 1817, he'd lived in Adams for nearly 2 decades. Moved there from North Carolina with his wife Lucy and their growing family when Tennessee was still scratching its way toward statehood. He'd watched the community grow from scattered homesteads to something resembling a proper settlement. He knew everyone. Everyone knew him. And that's exactly the problem nobody wants to talk about. The Bell family lived in what passed for comfort on the frontier. John and Lucy had 9 children by then, the youngest still toddling around the cabin, the oldest approaching marriageable age. Betsy, their daughter, had just turned 12, sharp as a tack, that girl, too sharp some would say later. Their home sat near a crossroads where neighbors gathered to trade gossip along with goods. Information flowed through that front porch like water through a mill wheel. Who was struggling to make their mortgage payments? Which families were feuding over property lines? What the local magistrates were deciding behind closed doors? John Bell heard it all, and he had opinions about most of it. Here's what the sanitized versions of this story never mention. John Bell was involved in a bitter land dispute that had been festering for months before the first supernatural incident occurred. The details get murky because nobody wanted to document the uglier side of frontier justice, but court records from Robertson County tell a different story than the ghost tales. Kate Batts, remember that name, owned property adjacent to Bell's farm. The boundary between their lands had been in dispute since 1816. Not unusual for the time. Surveying was rough work, and property lines were often more suggestion than fact. But this wasn't just about a few acres of disputed timber. Kate Batts was a widow trying to hold onto her late husband's property in a world that didn't make it easy for women to own land. She had children to think about, a future to secure. When men like John Bell started questioning her claim to acres she'd worked alongside her husband for years, it wasn't just about property lines. It was about survival. The story goes that Bell had purchased some of Batts' land, or thought he had. But the deed work was sloppy, the way it often was on the frontier. Batts claimed Bell had cheated her in the transaction. Bell claimed he'd paid fair price for land that was rightfully his to buy. Both versions might have been true. That's how these disputes usually worked. What we know for certain is this. By early 1817, the dispute had moved beyond neighborly disagreement. Court documents show that Kate Batts had filed a formal complaint against John Bell. She accused him of usury, charging excessive interest on a loan. This wasn't about land anymore. This was about money and reputation. In a small community like Adams, being branded a usurer could destroy a man's standing. It meant you preyed on your neighbor's desperation. It meant you couldn't be trusted. John Bell fought the accusation hard. The case went before the local church congregation first. That's how justice often worked in frontier communities. The church handled moral disputes before they reached the county courthouse. Bell stood before his neighbors and defended his character. He produced witnesses. He showed his accounting. Kate Batts wasn't satisfied with the outcome. You have to understand what this meant for a woman in 1817 Tennessee. She'd taken a public stand against a prominent male landowner. She'd accused him of cheating her. She'd fought him in court and lost. In a community where reputation was everything, she'd been branded the troublemaker. But Kate Batts had something John Bell hadn't counted on. She had allies, and they had patience. The first supernatural incident at the Bell farm occurred in late summer 1817, just weeks after the church tribunal ruled in Bell's favor. The family reported strange knocking sounds in the walls of their cabin, scratching noises, the sound of something or someone trying to get inside. Nobody connected it to the land dispute at first. Why would they? But here's what should make you pause. The phenomena didn't target the entire Bell family equally. John Bell bore the brunt of the supernatural assault from the very beginning. His health deteriorated rapidly. He suffered seizures that no doctor could explain. He complained of feeling like someone was choking him in his sleep. Meanwhile, some members of the Bell family seemed almost protected. Betsy Bell, that sharp 12-year-old daughter, never experienced the violent physical attacks that plagued her father. Instead, the entity which eventually claimed to be the spirit of Kate Batts herself seemed to communicate with Betsy. Protect her even. The ghost called itself Kate. Just Kate, draw your own conclusions. The attacks escalated through the fall of 1817. Visitors came from neighboring counties to witness the phenomena. Word spread. The Bell Witch became famous throughout Middle Tennessee before the family had even figured out what was happening to them. But nobody asked the obvious questions. Nobody investigated who might benefit from John Bell's suffering. Nobody looked closely at the timing, the targets, the patterns. Because here's the part that should bother you. The Bell Witch phenomena followed rules. It had limits. It knew things about the family that only close neighbors would know. It took sides in family disputes. It expressed political opinions that aligned suspiciously well with the interests of certain local families. Ghosts don't usually have such specific agendas. The supernatural explanation satisfied everyone because it meant nobody had to look too closely at the human motivations behind the terror. Nobody had to examine which families in Adams might have felt wronged by John Bell. Nobody had to consider whether a group of neighbors might be capable of systematically destroying a man who'd gotten too comfortable with other people's business. But before we get to how they did it, you need to understand exactly what John Bell had done to earn this kind of focused hatred. Because the land dispute with Kate Batts was just the beginning. John Bell's real mistake wasn't cheating a widow out of a few acres. His real mistake was thinking he could get away with it. The thing about land disputes in early Tennessee, they weren't just arguments over property lines, they were declarations of war. John Bell knew this when he made his first mistake in 1804. He'd been in Robertson County barely 3 years when he spotted a choice piece of bottom land along the Red River. Rich soil, good drainage, the kind of property that could set a man up for life if he played it right. But Bell didn't just want to buy the land. He wanted to acquire it in a way that would cut out the middleman entirely. The story goes that Bell discovered a technical flaw in the original land grant. Some clerical error from years back, a misstated survey, maybe, or a boundary description that didn't match the actual terrain. The kind of bureaucratic slip that happened all the time when you were trying to parcel out wilderness using nothing but compass readings and tree markers. Most men would have pointed out the error quietly, maybe negotiated a fair price with the current owner. Not John Bell. Bell took his discovery straight to the county courthouse and filed a claim on the entire tract. Not a purchase, a claim. As in, this land was never legally owned by anyone else, so now it belongs to me. You can imagine how well that went over. The person who lost their land in Bell's legal maneuver wasn't some distant speculator or government bureaucrat. It was Kate Batts, a local woman who'd been working that property for the better part of a decade. Now, here's where the official histories get vague. They'll tell you Kate Batts was Bell's neighbour. They'll mention she had some kind of dispute with him. But they won't tell you exactly what Bell's land grab cost her. Kate Batts wasn't just any settler. She was a widow trying to hold on to the only security she had left. That land Bell claimed. It included her cabin, her cleared fields, and the graves of 2 children she'd buried under a stand of oak trees near the creek. Bell's legal filing didn't just take her property. It erased any claim she had to the place where her family was buried. But here's the part that should bother you. The court sided with Bell immediately. No lengthy deliberation. No attempt to find a compromise that might let Kate Batts keep at least the homestead. The judge looked at Bell's paperwork, nodded, and transferred ownership of 320 acres in a single afternoon. You'd think someone would have questioned the speed of that decision. You'd think someone might have wondered why a man of Bell's limited standing in the community suddenly had enough legal sophistication to navigate territorial land law better than people who'd been there for years. Nobody asked those questions. At least, nobody who left a record of asking. What we do know is this. Within 6 months of acquiring the Batts property, John Bell had expanded his holdings to over 1,000 acres. He built a larger house. He bought slaves. He started lending money to other farmers at interest rates that made him deeply unpopular but undeniably wealthy. The transformation was remarkable. Bell had arrived in Tennessee as a small farmer with modest means. By 1806, he was one of the largest landowners in Robertson County and the unofficial banker for half the settlement. But success like that comes with a price. And in a community where everyone knows everyone else's business, people started talking. They talked about how Bell always seemed to know which properties had questionable titles before anyone else did. They talked about his sudden expertise in territorial law. They talked about the way he could predict which claims the court would approve and which ones it would reject. Most of all, they talked about Kate Batts. You know, if you're still listening at this point, you're one of us. Hit subscribe. We uncover a new American mystery every single night. Because Kate Batts hadn't just disappeared quietly into the Tennessee wilderness after losing her land. She'd stayed in the area. She'd taken work as a seamstress and herb woman, moving from farm to farm, never quite settling anywhere permanently. And everywhere she went, she told the same story. John Bell had stolen her land through courthouse corruption. John Bell had friends among the territorial officials who helped him identify properties he could claim. John Bell was getting rich by destroying families like hers. The problem was nobody could prove it. Bell's paperwork was always perfect. His legal arguments were always technically sound. If there was corruption involved, it was the kind that left no documentary trail. But Kate Batts had something Bell couldn't control through legal maneuvering. She had time, she had nothing left to lose, and she had a very long memory. By 1808, strange things started happening around John Bell's property. Tools would go missing from his fields. Fences would be found torn down in the morning. His horses would spook for no apparent reason, sometimes badly enough to throw their riders. Bell blamed wolves. He blamed thieves. He blamed everything except the possibility that someone might be conducting a very deliberate campaign to make his life difficult. But the incidents kept escalating. And they followed a pattern that suggested someone with intimate knowledge of Bell's daily routines and property layout. Someone who might have lived on that land long enough to know every path, every hiding spot, every way to move unseen. The Bell family would later claim the haunting began in 1817. But people who lived in the area remember the trouble starting much earlier than that. They remember John Bell complaining about mysterious disturbances as early as 1809. They also remember that Kate Batts seemed to know about these incidents before Bell reported them to anyone else. Hold that detail in your mind. Because when we start examining the famous Bell Witch phenomena that made this case legendary, you're going to find that the ghost knew things only Kate Batts could have known. And Kate Batts had spent nearly a decade learning everything there was to learn about John Bell's habits, his family, his property, and his secrets. You know what's strange about the Bell Witch story? For all the books written, all the documentaries made, all the ghost tour that still run through Adams, Tennessee today, nobody ever asks about Kate Batts. Oh, they mention her. She gets a paragraph, maybe two if the author's feeling generous. She's the neighbor woman, the eccentric widow, the one who supposedly cursed John Bell after their land dispute. But then the story rushes past her, racing toward the supernatural fireworks. The invisible hands. The disembodied voice. The family terrorized by an angry spirit. Here's what they don't tell you. Kate Batts wasn't some crazy hermit muttering hexes in the woods. She was one of the most connected women in Robertson County, and she had very good reasons to hate John Bell. Let's start with what we know for certain. Kate Batts was born Catherine Porter around 1760, married Frederick Batts in 1782. When Frederick died in 1815, he left her substantial property, over 300 acres along the Red River. Not bad for a frontier widow, not bad at all. But here's where the official records get interesting. Kate didn't retreat into widow's weeds and fade away. She doubled down. She bought more land. She sold land. She loaned money at interest. She took people to court when they didn't pay up. The Robertson County court records show Kate Batts involved in more than a dozen legal proceedings between 1815 and 1820. You want to know what kind of woman Kate Batts was? In 1817, the same year the Bell Witch supposedly appeared, she sued 3 different neighbors for debt collection. All 3 cases she won. The court ordered them to pay up or forfeit property. Kate Batts was nobody's victim. So when John Bell claimed Kate cursed his family, you have to understand what that really meant in 1817 Tennessee. It meant a financially savvy widow had gone up against one of the county's most prominent men, and she'd made him look bad in public. The land dispute between Bell and Batts wasn't some minor squabble over a fence line. Court records show it involved a 20-acre tract that both claimed ownership to. Bell said he'd bought it fair and square. Batts said the original survey was fraudulent. The case dragged on for months. Now here's the part that should bother you. When you read the Bell Witch accounts written years later, they make Kate Batts sound like she was the aggressor, the angry neighbor lady who couldn't let go of a grudge. But the court documents tell a different story. In April 1817, the court ruled in Kate Batts' favor. The land was hers. John Bell had to pay court costs and return the disputed acreage. It was a public humiliation for a man who'd built his reputation on shrewd land deals. 3 months later, in July 1817, the Bell family reported their first supernatural encounter. You see the timeline, right? You see how convenient that is. But let's dig deeper into who Kate Batts really was. Because the ghost story version of her, the bitter crone casting hexes, that's not the woman the historical record shows us. Kate Batts owned enslaved people, 3 of them according to the 1820 census. In a county where most farmers worked their own land, that put her in the upper tier economically. She wasn't scratching out a living on some hardscrabble plot. She was running a profitable farming operation. More importantly, she had allies. The Batts family had been in Robertson County since the 1780s. Kate's brother-in-law served on the county court. Her late husband's business partners still owed her favors. When Kate Batts wanted something done, she had the connections to make it happen. The Bell family, by contrast, were relative newcomers. John Bell had arrived from North Carolina in 1804. 13 years might seem like a long time, but in a place where some families had been clearing land since the Revolution, the Bells were still outsiders. And here's something else the ghost stories don't mention. Kate Batts wasn't the only neighbor who had problems with John Bell. Court records show Bell involved in boundary disputes with at least 4 other families between 1810 and 1817. He had a reputation for pushing legal boundaries, for finding loopholes, for interpreting surveys in ways that somehow always benefited John Bell. The Whisper Network in Robertson County knew what kind of man John Bell was. Kate Batts just happened to be the one with enough money and stubbornness to fight him in court. But winning in court was one thing, making sure the victory stuck was another. Because here's what happened after Kate Batts won her case. John Bell appealed. He filed new surveys. He claimed the original judgment was based on faulty evidence. He tied up that 20-acre tract in legal knots that could have taken years to untangle. Unless, of course, something happened to discourage John Bell from continuing his legal challenges. Something that made him too distracted, too frightened, too focused on other problems to keep fighting Kate Batts in court. You're starting to see it, aren't you? The shape of what really happened. Because there's one more thing about Kate Batts that the ghost stories always skip over. She didn't live alone on that 300-acre farm. The 1820 census lists 9 people in her household, 3 enslaved workers, yes, but also 5 others, family members, hired hands, people loyal to Kate Batts, people who owed her their livelihood, people who might be willing to help their benefactor settle a score with a neighbor who tried to steal her land. The Bell witch haunting began in July 1817. By October, John Bell had dropped all legal challenges to Kate Batts' property claim. He never pursued the matter again. Draw your own conclusions about cause and effect. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because before you can understand how Kate Batts might have orchestrated the most famous haunting in American history, you need to understand the lawsuit that gave her both motive and opportunity. The legal case that history forgot. The one that explains everything about what happened next to the Bell family. The court records from Robertson County tell a different story than the ghost tales. While the Bell family claimed supernatural persecution, the legal documents reveal something far more earthbound. Money, lots of money. and a woman who had every reason to want John Bell destroyed. Kate Batts filed her lawsuit against John Bell in the spring of 1817. The same spring the haunting began. You'd think someone would have connected those dots, but apparently nobody wanted to look that closely at the timing. The suit claimed Bell had defrauded her out of significant property in their land deal, not the minor dispute historians later made it out to be, but a substantial claim that could have ruined Bell financially. The lawsuit wasn't just about money, though. It was about reputation. In a frontier community like Adams, your word was your currency. If the court found that John Bell had deliberately cheated a widow, and not just any widow but Kate Batts, whose family had deep roots in the settlement, it would have destroyed more than his finances. It would have made him a pariah. Here's what the court filings actually say, and nobody talks about this part. Kate Batts claimed John Bell had sold her land he didn't legally own, that he had forged documents, that he had conspired with other men in the community to defraud her of property worth approximately $2,000. In 1817 money, that's not pocket change. That's the kind of sum that could set a family up for life or destroy them completely. But here's where it gets interesting. The lawsuit was moving forward. Depositions were being taken. Witnesses were being called. And John Bell was losing. The evidence Kate Batts had assembled was compelling enough that the court was preparing to rule in her favor, which means John Bell was about to face financial ruin and social exile in the community where he'd built his life. That's when the ghost showed up. Suddenly, instead of talking about John Bell's alleged fraud, everyone in Adams was talking about the supernatural entity tormenting his family. Instead of focusing on Kate Batts' legal claims, the community was debating whether spirits could move physical objects. The timing wasn't coincidental. It was surgical. Now you might ask, how does a ghost story make a lawsuit disappear? Simple. It changes the narrative. Kate Batts wasn't just a wronged widow seeking justice anymore. She was the suspected witch whose supernatural powers were attacking an innocent family. Hard to maintain credibility in court when half the county thinks you're in league with evil spirits. The depositions that had been damning John Bell suddenly seemed irrelevant. Why focus on mundane questions of property law when there were supernatural mysteries to solve? The community's attention, and more importantly, the court's attention, shifted entirely. Kate Batts found herself defending against whispered accusations of witchcraft instead of prosecuting her legitimate legal claims. The legal proceedings didn't officially stop. They just slowed down. Witnesses became harder to schedule. Depositions were postponed. The judge seemed less eager to push the case forward. After all, if there really was supernatural activity involved, wouldn't it be prudent to wait and see how things developed? Nobody wanted to be the magistrate who ignored potential witchcraft, even if they didn't quite believe in it themselves. Meanwhile, the Bell family's supernatural troubles were providing them with something invaluable: sympathy. John Bell wasn't a potential fraudster anymore. He was a victim. His family wasn't benefiting from ill-gotten gains. They were suffering under a terrible curse. The community rallied around them, offering support and protection against the mysterious entity that had chosen to torment them. By 1818, Kate Batts' lawsuit had effectively died. Not officially, the records show it was eventually dismissed for lack of prosecution, but practically, it was dead the moment people started whispering about supernatural revenge. You can't win a fraud case when the defendant is seen as the victim of otherworldly persecution. But here's the part that should bother you. Somebody had to orchestrate this. Ghost stories don't just spontaneously appear at the exact moment they're most useful. Someone had to plant the initial rumors. Someone had to feed them. Someone had to make sure they spread in just the right way to achieve maximum impact on public opinion. The Bell family claimed they were as surprised as anyone by the supernatural visitations, but the timing suggests otherwise. The phenomena began just as the lawsuit was gaining momentum. They intensified whenever Kate Batts tried to refocus attention on the legal proceedings, and they conveniently provided explanations for any strange behavior or late-night activities around the Bell property that neighbors might have noticed. You start to see the genius of it. If you need to discredit someone, you don't attack them directly. That creates martyrs. You create a narrative where they become the villain in someone else's tragedy. Kate Batts wasn't just wrong about the land deal, she was the supernatural force destroying a good family. The evidence she'd compiled wasn't proof of fraud, it was the motive for her otherworldly revenge. The court records end abruptly in 1819. Kate Batts' case was dismissed. John Bell kept his land, his money, and his reputation. The family that had been facing financial ruin instead became the center of the most famous ghost story in American history. Not a bad outcome for someone who had been caught red-handed in what appeared to be a significant fraud. But the dismissal of the lawsuit didn't end Kate Batts' troubles, because by then, the ghost story had taken on a life of its own. And the entity that had supposedly been summoned to torment the Bell family was about to find a new target. Someone younger, someone more vulnerable, someone who couldn't fight back. The Bell Witch was done with John Bell. Now it wanted his daughter. Betsy Bell was 12 years old when the family decided she was possessed. Not 13, not 14, 12, an age when girls in Robertson County were still considered children, still expected to help with chores and mind their manners and speak only when spoken to. An age when their bodies were changing in ways nobody talked about, when they were caught between childhood and something else entirely. The timing wasn't coincidence. You have to understand what 12 meant for a girl in 1817 Tennessee. Old enough to work, old enough to be useful, but not old enough to question what the adults were telling her about her own experience. Not old enough to have the vocabulary for what might really be happening to her body, her mind, her family. The Bell family had been dealing with their entity for months before they decided it was focused on Betsy. Those early incidents, the scratching in the walls, the covers being pulled off beds, the sounds nobody could explain, those affected everyone. But suddenly, around the time Betsy turned 12, the story changed. Now the spirit had a target. Now it had a purpose. Now it wasn't just random supernatural mischief, it was something darker, something that seemed to follow one particular member of the family wherever she went. Draw your own conclusions about why the family narrative shifted exactly when it did. The men who came to investigate weren't random curiosity seekers. They were neighbors, church members. People who knew the Bell family personally, who had business dealings with John Bell, who understood the social dynamics at play in their small community. James Johnson, a landowner. John Johnston, who'd had his own disputes with Kate Batts. William Porter, whose family had been in Robertson County since before statehood. These weren't gullible strangers looking for a ghost story. These were men with reputations to protect, Men who understood that what they witnessed and reported would follow them for the rest of their lives. So when they started documenting that the supernatural activity centered on Betsy Bell, when they began describing how the entity seemed to speak through her, torment her, single her out for special attention, you have to ask yourself what they were really seeing. The physical symptoms started subtly. Betsy would have what her family called spells, moments where she seemed to lose control of her own body, where her voice would change, where she would say things that didn't sound like her own words. In 1817, nobody had language for dissociation. Nobody understood trauma responses. Nobody talked about what happened to children who lived in households where tension ran so high that neighbors could feel it when they walked through the door. What they did have was a ready explanation that made everyone else feel better about what they were witnessing. Supernatural possession absolved everyone of responsibility. It meant nobody had to ask uncomfortable questions about what might be happening to a 12-year-old girl in a family under extreme social and financial pressure. The isolation helped the narrative take hold. The Bell farm sat far enough from town that visitors had to make a deliberate journey to get there. When they arrived, they found themselves in a space entirely controlled by the family, where the family's version of events was the only version available. No independent witnesses. No objective observers. Just the Bells and whoever they chose to invite into their home, into their story, into their carefully constructed version of what was happening to their daughter. And here's the part that should bother you. Not one of those men who came to investigate ever suggested removing Betsy from the situation. Not one of them recommended that maybe a 12-year-old girl experiencing supernatural torment should be taken somewhere safe, somewhere away from whatever force was supposedly tormenting her. Instead, they documented it. They wrote about it. They turned her suffering into entertainment. The entity had opinions about Betsy's future that aligned remarkably well with adult concerns. It opposed her relationship with Joshua Gardner, a local boy she'd apparently grown fond of. It had strong feelings about who she should and shouldn't associate with, about how she should behave, about what kind of woman she should become. For a supernatural force, it had very conventional ideas about female propriety. The spirit that supposedly possessed Betsy Bell never encouraged her to be rebellious in ways that actually mattered. It never told her to question authority, to demand education, to refuse the limitations placed on women in 1817 Tennessee. Instead, it performed rebellion in ways that ultimately reinforced her powerlessness, making her the center of attention while ensuring she had no control over that attention. The family insisted that Betsy had no control over what the entity said or did through her. She was described as a victim, a vessel, someone things happened to rather than someone with agency in her own story. But consider what that narrative accomplished. It meant that anything disturbing that emerged during her possessions couldn't be attributed to her own thoughts or feelings. It meant that any accusations, any revelations, any uncomfortable truths that came out during these episodes could be dismissed as supernatural rather than personal. It was the perfect setup for a 12-year-old girl who might have had things to say that her family didn't want to hear. The physical manifestations escalated as more witnesses arrived. Furniture moved. Objects flew across rooms. The entity became more vocal, more dramatic, more willing to perform for an audience. Which raises a question nobody wanted to ask in 1817, and that most people still don't want to ask today. What happens when a traumatized child discovers that certain behaviors guarantee adult attention, even if that attention comes wrapped in fear and supernatural explanation? What happens when performing distress becomes the only way to be heard? The Bell Witch story spread through Robertson County like wildfire, but it didn't spread randomly. It followed specific social networks, moved through particular families, gained credibility from particular sources. The same men who had business connections to John Bell, the same families who had been affected by Kate Batts's legal challenges, the same social circle that had watched the Bell family's reputation shift from respected to questionable over the course of several years. These weren't neutral observers documenting supernatural phenomena. These were community members with their own stakes in how the story was told, their own reasons for supporting one version of events over another. By early 1818, Betsy Bell had become the most famous person in Robertson County. Visitors came from Nashville, from Kentucky, from as far away as North Carolina to witness the supernatural phenomena surrounding her. She was 12 years old and she was a tourist attraction. Nobody asked her how she felt about that. Nobody recorded her own thoughts about being the center of a story that was spinning beyond anyone's control. Nobody seemed to consider that the girl at the heart of the Bell Witch haunting might have her own perspective on what was happening to her. She was the perfect victim because she was young enough to be controlled, old enough to be blamed, and powerless enough that her own voice could be easily drowned out by the adults who claimed to speak for her. But here's what nobody talks about in the traditional telling of the Bell Witch story. The sounds that made the family famous weren't just random supernatural noise. They had patterns, they had timing. They seemed to respond to specific triggers and specific audiences. And if you listen carefully to the descriptions that survived, if you pay attention to when the phenomena occurred and when they didn't, you start to notice something that changes everything about how this story should be understood. The entity was performing, and someone was directing the performance. The scratching started small, just a sound in the walls that John Bell mentioned to his neighbor, James Johnson, one morning in late September. Johnson later wrote that Bell seemed embarrassed to bring it up, like a man admitting he'd been hearing things, but the scratching didn't stay small. Within a week it had company, knocking sounds, not the settling of green timber or the scurrying of mice. Deliberate knocks that came in patterns, 3 quick raps, a pause, 3 more. Then silence that stretched just long enough to make you wonder if you'd imagined it. The Bell family gathered in their main room each evening, oil lamps casting shadows that danced with each mysterious sound. John Bell sat rigid in his chair, jaw clenched. Lucy Bell clutched her Bible. The children, Betsy, Joel, Richard, and the younger ones, huddled together on the wooden bench their father had built. You have to understand the timing here. This wasn't some random haunting that picked the Bell family out of thin air. Kate Batts had filed her lawsuit against John Bell just months earlier. The legal proceedings were dragging on, eating at the family's finances and reputation. Every neighbor in Robertson County knew about the disputed land deal. And now, suddenly, the Bell house was alive with sounds nobody could explain. The knocking evolved. It learned to respond. When John Bell would knock twice on his table, the invisible presence would knock twice back. When he tried 3 knocks, 3 answered from the walls. It was like teaching a child to count, except the child was something no one could see. But here's where the story gets interesting. The The sounds weren't random. They followed patterns that suggested intelligence, sure, but they also followed patterns that suggested performance. The phenomena escalated on a schedule that any modern investigator would recognize. Week 1, scratching. Week 2, knocking. Week 3, sounds that resembled voices or whispered words that could have been anything but that the family began to interpret as threats. Richard Williams Bell, John's son, would later write the most detailed account of these early manifestations. But Richard was only 10 years old in 1817. His memories, recorded decades later, have the suspicious clarity of someone who's told the same story so many times that the details have crystallized into something that feels more real than memory. The sounds began to have an audience. Word spread through Robertson County faster than news of a good harvest or a bad death. Neighbors started visiting the Bell farm in the evenings, gathering in the main room to witness the mysterious phenomena. And the phenomena performed. James Johnson brought his wife. The knocking responded to her questions. Drew Batts, yes, Kate Batts' nephew, came with a group of men from town. The sounds grew louder, more aggressive when certain visitors arrived. Almost as if whatever was causing them recognized faces, held grudges. Frank Miles, a local minister, attempted to bless the house. The phenomena responded by becoming violent during his visit. Scratching turned to pounding. The gentle knocks became thunderous blows that seemed to shake the entire structure. But nobody ever saw what was causing the sounds. Nobody caught a glimpse of movement in their peripheral vision. No objects moved. No doors opened by themselves. Just sounds that seemed to know exactly how to affect their audience. The Bell family's reaction became part of the performance. Lucy Bell would gasp and clutch her children. John Bell would demand answers from the empty air. Betsy, now 13 and the focus of increasing attention, would sometimes cry, sometimes laugh, sometimes fall into strange fits that looked suspiciously like the revival meetings that swept through Tennessee in those days. The neighbors ate it up. This was better than any traveling show, any circuit preacher's fire and brimstone sermon. The Bell House became the most popular destination in Robertson County. People rode for miles to witness the haunting. And here's what should bother you. Not once in any of the contemporary accounts does anyone suggest calling in outside investigators. No one brings scholars from Nashville. No one contacts the territorial authorities. The Bell family, supposedly terrorized by supernatural forces, never seeks help beyond their immediate community. They just manage the crowds. John Bell began charging admission. Not officially, that would have been unseemly for a respected landowner, but visitors were expected to contribute to the household to help with the burden of hosting so many guests. Food, money, labor, the Bell farm began receiving more resources than it had ever generated through crops or livestock. The sounds responded to the economics. On nights when the house was full of paying visitors, the phenomena were spectacular. On quiet evenings when only the family was present, things remained mysteriously calm. Lucy Bell started keeping a guest book. Names, dates, testimonials. She was documenting not just the haunting, but the witness list, building a reputation that would outlast whatever was actually happening in that log house. The children learned their roles. Joel and Richard would translate the knocking sounds, claiming they could understand what the entity was trying to communicate. Betsy became the primary target, the one the presence seemed to focus on most intensely. The younger children provided an audience of innocence. their wide-eyed fear lending authenticity to every performance. But watch the timeline. The phenomena began just as John Bell's legal troubles with Kate Batts were intensifying. They escalated as more neighbors learned about the disputed land deal. And they became most dramatic whenever visitors arrived who might spread word of the Bell family's supernatural persecution throughout Robertson County and beyond. By December 1817, the Bell Witch, though she hadn't claimed that name yet, was famous throughout Middle Tennessee. The family that had been facing financial ruin and social disgrace 3 months earlier was now hosting the most talked-about attraction in the region. The sounds had made them celebrities. The haunting had become their salvation. But fame is a hungry thing, and the entity that lived in the walls of the Bell house was about to demand a much higher price for its performances. What Richard Williams Bell remembered about those early days would shape every ghost story told in America for the next 2 centuries. But Richard was just a child, watching his family transform from desperate landowners into the stars of their own supernatural theatre. His convenient memory would become the foundation of the most enduring lie in American folklore. "69 years after the Bell Witch supposedly vanished, Richard Williams Bell decided to tell his story. The youngest Bell child, barely 4 when the haunting began, suddenly had perfect recall of events that terrorized his family. He published Our Family Trouble in 1886, the definitive account that shaped every ghost story, every book, every documentary about the Bell Witch that followed. You'd think a 4-year-old's memories might be fuzzy after 7 decades. Richard didn't see it that way. He remembered conversations word for word. He remembered the exact sequence of supernatural events. He remembered his sister Betsy's torment in precise detail. Most remarkably, he remembered things he couldn't possibly have witnessed as a small child, late-night conversations between adults, private moments between his parents, events that happened when he wasn't even in the room. But here's what should bother you. Richard Williams Bell didn't just remember the Bell Witch story, he created it. By the time Richard decided to write his book, most of the original witnesses were dead. His father, John Bell, dead in 1820. His mother, Lucy, dead in 1837. His older brothers, John Jr. and Drury, both dead. Even Kate Batts, the woman at the center of the whole mess, had died in 1850. The only major players still breathing were Richard himself and his sister Betsy. And Betsy, according to family letters that survived, wanted nothing to do with dredging up the past. She'd moved to Mississippi, married, raised children, and spent 40 years trying to forget Adams, Tennessee ever existed. So Richard had the field to himself. No one left to contradict his version of events. No one to say, wait, that's not how it happened. No one to point out the convenient gaps in his story. Richard claimed he based his book on his mother's diary. Lucy Bell's detailed daily account of the haunting, written as events unfolded. The smoking gun that would prove everything really happened exactly as the family claimed. There's just one problem. That diary never existed. Not a single page of Lucy Bell's supposed journal has ever been found. No family member mentioned it in letters. No neighbor recalled seeing Lucy writing in any diary during the haunting years. The Robertson County Courthouse, where important family documents were sometimes stored, has no record of any Bell family diary in their archives. But Richard needed that diary to exist, because without it, People might ask uncomfortable questions about a 4-year-old's impossibly detailed memories of events from 1817 to 1821. So why did Richard Williams Bell wait almost 70 years to tell this story? Why did he suddenly feel compelled to preserve his family's supernatural experiences for posterity when he was pushing 80 years old? The answer has nothing to do with ghosts. It has everything to do with money. By 1886, the Bell Witch story had become local legend. Visitors traveled to Adams, Tennessee, hoping to hear first-hand accounts from surviving family members. They wanted to see the Bell farm. They wanted to walk the same ground where America's most famous ghost had tormented a frontier family. Tourism was becoming serious business in post-Civil War Tennessee. Towns across the South were discovering that a good ghost story could bring in more revenue than tobacco farming. Richard wasn't just preserving family history, he was cashing in on it. His book became the template for every Bell Witch tour guide, every local historian, every entrepreneur who wanted to profit from the family's supposed supernatural experiences. Richard sold copies at the general store. He gave paid lectures. He guided wealthy visitors around the property, pointing out the exact spots where the witch had manifested. But here's where Richard's story falls apart under scrutiny. The supernatural events he described in such vivid detail don't match the timeline of his family's actual legal troubles with Kate Batts. Remember, the real Bell family crisis centered on that land dispute with Kate Batts. The lawsuit, the boundary disagreements, the accusations of fraud that could have cost John Bell everything he'd worked to build. Those legal problems peaked in 1819 and 1820. Court records show the most intense period of depositions, witness testimony, and legal maneuvering happened during those exact years. But in Richard's supernatural version, that's precisely when the haunting reached its climax. When the Bell Witch supposedly became most violent. When the entity focused its rage on John Bell personally, tormenting him until his mysterious death in December 1820. The timing isn't coincidental. Richard needed to transform his family's very real legal crisis into supernatural drama. He needed to make John Bell a victim rather than a man who might have defrauded his neighbor. So he created a story where the dates aligned perfectly, where every escalation in the haunting matched an escalation in the family's actual troubles, where supernatural forces, not legal consequences, drove John Bell to his grave. But Richard made mistakes. Details that don't add up. Conversations he claimed to remember that a 4-year-old couldn't have understood. Knowledge of legal proceedings that were kept private from young children. Most tellingly, Richard's account includes several supernatural events that supposedly happened after John Bell's death in December 1820. The ghost's final conversations with the family, its promises to return, its dramatic farewell. But by 1821, Richard Williams Bell was barely 8 years old. The family was dealing with probate courts, property settlements, and the aftermath of John Bell's sudden death. Lucy Bell was a widow with young children and massive debts to manage. Does it seem likely that an 8-year-old boy was paying attention to supernatural manifestations while his family's world fell apart around him? Or does it seem more likely that an elderly man, decades later, invented those final supernatural scenes to give his story a proper dramatic conclusion? The neighbors who lived through the actual events, the ones who testified in the land dispute, who witnessed the family's legal troubles, who saw John Bell's health decline under the pressure of potential financial ruin, they told a different story. They remembered a family under siege, but not from supernatural forces. They remembered late-night meetings, hushed conversations, and a man slowly cracking under the weight of accusations he couldn't quite deny. They remembered Betsy Bell as a teenage girl caught in the middle of her family's crisis, not as the victim of paranormal assault that Richard later described. But those neighbors weren't around in 1886 to contradict Richard's version. Their children had heard different stories growing up, stories about land fraud, boundary disputes, and the very human consequences of greed. Richard Williams Bell spent the last years of his life turning his family's shame into their claim to fame. He transformed a story about fraud and legal trouble into America's most enduring ghost story. And it worked. His book became the foundation for every supernatural account that followed. Every paranormal investigator, every ghost hunter, every documentary filmmaker who tackled the Bell Witch story used Richard's 1886 book as their primary source. None of them asked the obvious question: how much of this story came from a 4-year-old's memories and how much came from an old man's imagination? But the neighbors who lived through the real events left their own records, court documents, letters, testimony that paints a very different picture of what actually happened to the Bell family in Adams, Tennessee. And those neighbors saw things that Richard Williams Bell never included in his supernatural account. Things that make the whole haunting story look very different once you know what to look for. The problem with the Bell Witch story isn't what people saw, it's what they chose to see. By early 1818, word had spread through Robertson County like smoke from a chimney fire. The Bell family was being tormented by something supernatural, something that spoke, something that knew secrets, something that particularly hated John Bell and seemed oddly protective of his daughter Betsy. But here's what the neighbors actually witnessed. And here's why their testimony matters more than any family member's account. James Johnson lived 2 miles down the dirt road from the Bell farm. He kept detailed records in a leather-bound journal, still exists in the Tennessee State Archives. Johnson's entries from February through May 1818 tell a very different story than what Richard Williams Bell would later publish. Johnson's first entry about the Bell situation is dated February 15, 1818. He writes, "Visited Bell Place today. Family claims spirit troubles. Heard rapping sounds from walls. John Bell appeared nervous, kept steering conversation away from recent land disputes. Betsy Bell seemed well-rehearsed in her responses about the manifestations." Well-rehearsed, that's Johnson's phrase, not mine. Johnson wasn't the only neighbor taking notes. Frank Miles, who owned the mill where everyone brought their grain, recorded conversations with Bell family visitors. Miles noticed something peculiar. The supernatural events always seemed to intensify when certain people were present, and they always seemed to calm down when John Bell left the property. You'd think that would raise questions, right? But here's where it gets interesting. The neighbors weren't just passive observers. Some of them started conducting their own experiments. Calvin Johnston, remember that name, it's about to become important, owned the farm adjacent to the Bell property. Johnston had served in the War of 1812. He wasn't easily spooked, and he wasn't easily fooled. In March 1818, Johnston decided to spend 3 consecutive nights at the Bell house, documenting everything he witnessed. Johnston's account, preserved in a letter to his brother in Kentucky, describes the first night in detail. He arrived at sunset and positioned himself in the main room where the family gathered each evening. The Bell family performed their usual routine, gathering around the fireplace, discussing the day's work, waiting for the supernatural manifestations to begin. Around 9 o'clock, the sounds started, scratching in the walls, rappings that seemed to respond to questions, and then the voice, that mysterious entity that called itself Kate and claimed to be the spirit of Kate Batts. But Johnston was watching faces, not listening to sounds. He noticed that young Betsy Bell's lips moved slightly before each vocal response from the supposed spirit. He observed that the scratching sounds always originated from areas of the room where family members had been positioned earlier in the day. Most tellingly, he documented that John Bell's hands shook whenever the spirit voice mentioned the land dispute with Kate Batts. Johnston's second night revealed even more. He brought a piece of chalk and quietly marked the floorboards near where each family member sat. When the supernatural sounds began, he traced their locations. Every sound originated within arm's reach of a Bell family member. On the third night, Johnston tried something different. He asked John Bell to step outside with him for a private conversation. They walked to the barn, well out of earshot of the house. Inside, the family waited in the main room. For 30 minutes, the house remained completely silent. No rappings, no scratching, no mysterious voice. When Johnston and John Bell returned, the supernatural activity resumed within minutes. Johnston wrote to his brother, "I am convinced this is an elaborate deception. The question is whether the entire family is complicit, or whether John Bell has manipulated his wife and children into participating in something they don't fully understand. Now, this is the part nobody talks about." Johnston shared his observations with other neighbors. Word began to spread that the Bell Witch might not be supernatural at all. Some families started to distance themselves from the Bells. Others became more curious. But then something shifted. The story began to change. New witnesses appeared, people who claimed to have seen things that Johnston's careful observations couldn't explain. People who swore they'd witnessed supernatural events that no human trickery could have produced. You know, if you're still listening at this point, you're one of us. Hit subscribe. We uncover a new American mystery every single night. Here's what's interesting about these new witnesses. They weren't neighbors. They weren't long-time residents of Robertson County. They were visitors, travelers, people passing through who heard about the Bell Witch and decided to investigate for themselves. And every single one of them had one thing in common. They'd spoken with John Bell privately before witnessing any supernatural events. Dr. George Hobson traveled from Nashville specifically to investigate the Bell Witch phenomena. Hobson was a physician, trained in rational observation. He arrived skeptical and left convinced he'd witnessed genuine supernatural activity. But Hobson's published account contains a curious detail. He mentions that John Bell took him aside on his first evening at the house to explain the family's situation privately. Bell shared details about Kate Batts, about the land dispute, about his family's suffering. Bell also mentioned that the spirit seemed to respond more actively to visitors who approached the situation with an open mind. Hobson then witnessed a spectacular display of supernatural activity, objects moving without human touch, voices responding to questions no family member could have heard, sounds that seemed to originate from multiple locations simultaneously. The problem is this: every dramatic witness account follows the same pattern. Private conversation with John Bell, explanation of the family's suffering, suggestion that the spirit responds to believers, then spectacular supernatural display. Calvin Johnston noticed this pattern too. In his final letter to his brother, he wrote, "I believe John Bell has perfected a method of creating witnesses." He identifies visitors who want to believe, provides them with context that primes their expectations, then delivers an experience that confirms their preconceptions. But Johnston's theory had one major flaw. It didn't explain how the deception was being accomplished. The sounds, the voices, the moving objects, if it was trickery beyond anything anyone in rural Tennessee had ever encountered. Unless, of course, John Bell wasn't working alone. By spring of 1818, a new element entered the Bell Witch story. Visitors began reporting that the spirit had shared information it couldn't possibly have known, personal details about their lives, secrets about their families, knowledge about events happening in distant towns. The spirit of Kate Batts, it seemed, knew everything about everyone. But information isn't supernatural. Information is gathered. Information is shared. Information is weaponized. And in a small farming community where everyone knew everyone else's business, information was the most powerful currency of all. The neighbors saw exactly what John Bell wanted them to see. Some, like Calvin Johnston, recognized the performance for what it was. Others, like Dr. Hobson, became unwitting participants in the deception. But the real question isn't what the neighbors saw. The real question is what they were paid to see. Because by summer of 1818, something had changed in Robertson County. The Bell Witch wasn't just a local curiosity anymore. It was becoming a business. And that's when General Andrew Jackson decided to pay a visit. The most famous visitor to the Bell farm never actually visited. You've probably heard this part of the story. General Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory himself, riding up to John Bell's property with a wagon full of men, ready to investigate this supernatural business personally. The Bell Witch supposedly stopped his wagon dead in its tracks. Wheels locked, horses spooked. The future President of the United States forced to spend the night, only to flee the next morning after the entity terrorized his party. It's a hell of a story. Makes the Bell haunting seem legitimate, doesn't it? If Andrew Jackson himself came calling, this must have been serious business. Except Jackson never went to Adams, Tennessee. Not in 1819. Not ever. The Jackson visit first appears in print in 1894. That's 75 years after it supposedly happened. The source, Richard Williams Bell's manuscript, the same Richard who was 7 years old during the haunting and somehow remembered conversations word for word decades later. But here's what should bother you about the timing. By 1894, Andrew Jackson had been dead for nearly 50 years. He'd served as president, won the Battle of New Orleans, become a genuine American legend. Attaching his name to your ghost story in 1894 was like getting a celebrity endorsement from beyond the grave. Nobody could contradict it. Jackson wasn't around to say he'd never set foot on Bell property. So where was Jackson in 1819 when he was supposedly investigating supernatural phenomena in Tennessee, fighting the First Seminole War in Florida, leading troops through swampland, chasing hostile forces across the Spanish border, dealing with actual warfare, not phantom voices? The military records are clear. Jackson's movements during this period are well documented. He was nowhere near Adams, Tennessee. He was busy making the kind of history that actually happened. But the Bell family needed credibility. They needed someone important to validate their story. And by the 1890s, when Richard Williams Bell was finally writing everything down, Jackson's name carried the kind of weight that could turn a local scandal into American folklore. The real question isn't whether Jackson visited, it's why the Bell family needed people to think he did. Because by 1819 the haunting was becoming a problem for them. Word was spreading beyond Robertson County. Visitors were arriving daily, some curious, some skeptical, some looking to debunk the whole thing. The family needed to control the narrative before someone started asking the wrong questions. Think about it from their perspective. They'd created this elaborate performance to torment John Bell. It was working. The man was deteriorating exactly as planned, but success brought scrutiny, and scrutiny brought risk. What we do know is that several prominent Tennesseans visited the Bell farm during this period. State legislators, judges, men with real influence in Nashville society, but their names don't appear in the later accounts. Their visits get buried under the mythology. Why? Because these men weren't there as believers, they came as investigators, and some of them left with serious doubts about what they'd witnessed. Judge John McNary, a respected jurist who'd worked with Andrew Jackson in the past, visited the Bell farm in early 1820. He spent 3 days there, observed the phenomena carefully, interviewed family members separately, and according to his private correspondence, which survived in Nashville archives, he came away convinced the whole thing was an elaborate deception perpetrated by persons unknown for purposes unknown. McNary's letter to his brother, dated March 15, 1820, is worth reading carefully. He describes watching Betsy Bell during one of her supposed possessions, notes how her reactions seemed performed rather than authentic, mentions catching what he called meaningful glances between family members during supernatural events. Most tellingly, McNary writes that the phenomena seemed to occur on schedule. The entity would appear when visitors arrived, perform its tricks, then conveniently disappear when people started asking detailed questions about its origins or motivations. That's not how genuine supernatural events work. That's how theatre works. But Judge McNary's doubts never made it into the official Bell Witch legend. His skeptical assessment was buried in family letters, filed away in Nashville legal archives, forgotten by history. Instead, we got the Andrew Jackson story, the dramatic tale of America's military hero fleeing in terror from a Tennessee ghost. It's a much better story than the truth, a respected judge quietly concluding that the whole thing was fraud. Here's where it gets interesting, though. McNary wasn't the only skeptic. Other visitors during this period left similar accounts. Private letters, diary entries, personal observations that paint a very different picture than the one Richard Williams Bell would publish 70 years later. Dr. George Hobson, a Nashville physician who visited in April 1820, wrote to his colleague about observing what he called the most sophisticated case of hysteria and family collusion I have encountered in my practice. He noted that Betsy's symptoms aligned perfectly with contemporary medical understanding of nervous disorders, but that the family seemed unusually resistant to medical explanations. Reverend James Gunn, who spent a week at the Bell farm, recorded his suspicions that the supernatural events were too convenient in their timing and too theatrical in their presentation to be genuine manifestations of divine or diabolic origin. These men weren't superstitious backwoods farmers. They were educated professionals from Nashville society, and they were seeing through the performance. But their doubts never became part of the story. Instead, the Bell family mythology grew around the fictional Jackson visit, a tale so compelling that it overshadowed the actual documented skepticism of real visitors who actually were there. By the time Richard Williams Bell published his account in 1894, all these skeptical witnesses were dead. Their private doubts were locked away in archives. The field was clear for the Bell family to craft whatever version of events served their purposes. And they chose to invent a presidential endorsement rather than acknowledge the professional skepticism they'd actually encountered. The question you should be asking isn't whether Andrew Jackson visited the Bell farm. The question is, what were the Bell family so desperate to hide that they needed to fabricate the most famous supernatural endorsement in American history? Because the real visitors, the judges, doctors, and ministers who actually came to Adams, Tennessee, were starting to see through the performance. They were asking uncomfortable questions about timing, motivation, and method. They were treating the haunting not as supernatural phenomenon, but as potential fraud requiring investigation. And that kind of scrutiny was exactly what the Bell family couldn't afford. The people behind this elaborate revenge plot were running out of time. John Bell was dying, just as they'd planned. But their performance was attracting the wrong kind of attention from the right kind of people. They needed to end this thing before someone figured out what Kate Batts had been planning all along. What happened next would determine whether the Bell Witch became folklore or criminal conspiracy. Whether Kate Batts's revenge succeeded completely, or whether the truth finally caught up with the most elaborate hoax in American history. Kate Batts watched her world collapse one debt at a time. The lawsuit against John Bell had cost her everything she couldn't afford to lose: court fees, legal representation, the endless travel back and forth to the county seat while her farm went untended. You have to understand, in 1817 Robertson County, a woman fighting a land dispute wasn't just unusual. It was financial suicide. Her lawyer's bills alone consumed what little cash she had saved. Every motion filed, every deposition taken, every day spent in that courthouse was another day her crops went unharvested. Another day her livestock went unsold. Another day deeper into debt. But here's what the Bell family story never mentions. Kate Batts didn't just lose the lawsuit. She lost her farm. The foreclosure notice came in February 1818, 3 months after the court ruled in John Bell's favor. 3 months after she'd been ordered to pay his legal costs on top of her own. The bank that held her mortgage, the same bank where John Bell kept his accounts, called in her note. Coincidence? Draw your own conclusions. Kate had 30 days to settle her debts or lose everything. 30 days in the middle of winter when nobody was buying land and cash was scarce as honest politicians. The amount owed was precise, $347.16. The equivalent of about $8,000 today, might as well have been $8 million. She tried everything. Sold her livestock at winter prices, always the worst prices. Sold her furniture, her late husband's tools, even the silver locket her mother had given her. Still came up short by almost $200. The sheriff's sale happened on a Tuesday in March, cold morning with that bitter wind that cuts right through wool. Kate stood there and watched strangers bid on everything she'd built. Her cabin, her 40 acres of cleared land, The barn her husband had raised with his own hands. John Bell wasn't there. Sent his son Richard instead. Richard Bell bought her farm for $312, exactly $35 more than what she owed the bank, just enough to make it look legitimate, just enough to keep anyone from asking uncomfortable questions about why the Bell family suddenly needed more land right after destroying their neighbor in court. But here's the detail that should bother you. That $312, Richard Bell paid it with a bank draft drawn on his father's account. The same account that had somehow grown by several $100s right around the time Kate Batts lost her lawsuit. She had nowhere to go. No family left in Tennessee. No money for passage anywhere else. Kate Batts, who'd owned 40 acres and a house just 6 months earlier, was now a homeless woman in her 50s with $8 to her name. The neighbors who'd once borrowed her tools and asked her advice suddenly found reasons to cross the street when they saw her coming. Funny how quickly people forget your kindness when your circumstances change. Funny how fast you become invisible when you can't pay your debts. Kate found work where she could, washing clothes, tending sick children, the kind of back-breaking labor that pays in meals and roof space more often than actual money. She moved from house to house, family to family, never staying long enough to become a burden, never staying long enough to feel secure. And all the while, John Bell prospered. His crops flourished on the land that used to be hers. His children grew fat and healthy while she grew thin and hard. His reputation in the community remained spotless while hers became something people whispered about. The woman who'd tried to cheat honest John Bell. The woman who'd gotten what she deserved. You know what they say about revenge, it's a dish best served cold. Kate Batts had plenty of time to let hers freeze solid. She watched. She listened. She learned the Bell family's routines, their habits, their weaknesses. When you're invisible to people, you see things they never expect you to see. When you're washing their clothes and tending their sick, you hear things they never expect you to hear. Kate discovered that Betsy Bell walked the same path to the well every morning at dawn. Alone. She learned that the Bell cabin's walls were thin enough that voices carried from room to room. She found out which floorboards creaked and which windows stuck, and where the family kept their spare key. Most importantly, she learned that young Betsy Bell was prone to nightmares. Had been since childhood, according to the washing she overheard between Elizabeth Bell and her sister. The girl talked in her sleep, walked in her sleep, sometimes woke up screaming about things that weren't there. Perfect material for someone with Kate Batts' particular skills, because here's what the Bell family story never tells you. Kate Batts wasn't just a farmer's widow. She was what people in those days called a granny woman. A healer, someone who knew which plants could ease pain and which could cause it. Someone who understood that the line between medicine and poison often came down to dosage and timing. She knew plants that could make you see things that weren't there. Herbs that could make you hear voices in the wind. Roots that could give you vivid, terrifying dreams that felt more real than waking life. The Cherokee had taught her some of it. The rest she'd learned from other women like herself, women who'd survived by knowing things that men preferred to ignore. Women who understood that sometimes the best way to hurt someone wasn't with fists or weapons, but with fear. Kate spent months preparing, testing, experimenting, finding the right combinations, the right doses, the right delivery methods. She had nothing but time and a growing hunger for justice. The Bell family had taken everything from her. Her home, her land, her future. Her dignity. Now she was going to take something from them. Their peace of mind. But Kate Batts was too smart to simply poison the family and be done with it. That would have been crude, obvious, the kind of revenge that gets you hanged. She had something more elegant in mind, something that would destroy them slowly, methodically, in front of the entire community. She was going to make them famous. And fame, as John Bell would soon discover, can be the cruelest punishment of all. You know what nobody ever talks about when they tell the Bell Witch story? Money. The supernatural sells better than bankruptcy, I suppose. But if you want to understand what really happened in Adams, Tennessee, you need to follow the money. Because by 1817, John Bell wasn't just fighting a ghost. He was drowning in debt. The land deal with Kate Batts had been expensive from the start. Not just the purchase price, though that was steep enough for a frontier farmer. The legal fees were eating him alive. Every motion Kate's lawyer filed, every deposition, every court appearance. Bell was paying his attorney by the hour, and those hours were adding up fast. But that's just where it started. See, when you're tied up in a public lawsuit, word gets around. And when word gets around that you might be in financial trouble, credit dries up real quick. The merchants in town who used to extend Bell credit for supplies, for tools, for the basic necessities of running a farm, they wanted cash now. Up front. Bell's cotton crop that year hadn't been what he'd hoped. Too much rain in the spring, not enough in the summer. The kind of agricultural setbacks that a man with good credit can weather. But Bell's credit was shot. His neighbors knew about the lawsuit. They knew Kate Batts was claiming he'd cheated her. Whether they believed it or not, they weren't taking any chances with their money. Then there were the practical problems. The Bell farm depended on slave labor. That was the economic reality of Tennessee in 1817. But maintaining enslaved workers costs money. Food, clothing, basic medical care when someone gets sick or injured. And Bell was finding it harder and harder to cover those expenses. Some of his enslaved workers had been getting sick more often. Nothing dramatic, stomach ailments, headaches, general weakness. The kind of thing that keeps people from working at full capacity. Bell couldn't afford to have his labor force operating at half strength, but he also couldn't afford to hire additional help. Here's where it gets interesting. Remember how the Bell Witch supposedly had particular animosity toward John Bell himself. How it would slap him, make him sick, interfere with his daily activities. Well, a man who can't work his own farm because he's constantly under attack by supernatural forces. That man has a pretty convenient excuse for why his crops are failing and his debts are mounting. The whole family was feeling the pinch. Lucy Bell, who used to order fabric from Nashville for new dresses, was now mending everything twice. Betsy was wearing dresses that had been let out and taken in so many times the seams showed the history of her growing up. The Bell boys were doing more manual labor and less schooling. When you can't afford to hire help, your children become your workforce. Richard Williams Bell, the family chronicler, spent his days in the fields instead of with his books. But here's what should bother you about the timing. The Bell Witch manifestations, all those mysterious sounds, the physical attacks on John Bell, the disruption of daily life, they escalated right as Bell's financial situation became desperate. Not before, not after. Right when he needed an explanation for why everything was falling apart. Think about it from the neighbor's perspective. Here's John Bell, a man they've known for years, a man who's always been successful, always paid his debts, always kept his farm running smoothly. Suddenly he's sick all the time. His crops are failing. His family seems constantly on edge. If you didn't know about the lawsuit, if you didn't know about the mounting debts, what would you think? You'd think something supernatural was tormenting this poor family. And John Bell, consciously or not, wasn't exactly discouraging that interpretation. By late 1817, Bell was quietly putting out feelers about selling portions of his land. Not the house, not the main property. He couldn't afford to relocate the entire family. But some of the outlying fields, some of the less productive acreage. The problem was, who wants to buy land from a man who's supposedly cursed? Word was getting around about the strange happenings at the Bell farm. And in a community where reputation is everything, John Bell's reputation was becoming a liability. Every potential buyer had heard the stories, the mysterious sounds, the attacks on Bell himself, the general atmosphere of supernatural dread that seemed to hang over the property. Would you pay full price for haunted farmland? Neither would anyone else. The creditors weren't interested in ghost stories. They wanted their money. And by winter of 1817, several of them were making it clear that their patience was running out. Bell owed money to the bank in Nashville. He owed money to merchants in Adams. He owed money to his lawyer. He owed money to suppliers who'd extended credit for farm equipment and livestock. The supernatural harassment was becoming a convenient explanation for why John Bell couldn't meet his obligations. Hard to collect from a man who's being tormented by forces beyond human understanding, right? But the family was suffering real consequences. They were eating less, wearing older clothes, making do with less of everything. The stress was taking a physical toll on all of them, John Bell most of all. Whether the supernatural attacks were real or manufactured, the financial pressure was crushing. And that pressure was about to force the family into a decision that would change everything. Because here's what nobody talks about. In families facing financial ruin, daughters become assets. Marriage isn't just about love, it's about economic survival. A good marriage could solve all of the Bell family's problems in one ceremony. Betsy Bell was 17 years old, beautiful, and from a family that still had social standing in the community. Despite their financial troubles, the Bell name still carried weight. The right marriage could bring money into the family, could secure their future, could end their debt problems overnight. And wouldn't you know it, the Bell witch was about to develop some very strong opinions about Betsy's romantic prospects. Strong enough to break up an engagement that might have saved the family from financial ruin. Which brings us to the spring of 1818 and a love story that was doomed from the start. Not by supernatural forces, but by a family that needed a different kind of ending. March 15, 1820. Betsy Bell walks back into her father's house and tells her family that her engagement to Joshua Gardner is over. Just like that. No explanation, no tearful scene, no dramatic confrontation. After months of planning a wedding that the entire community expected, Betsy simply says it's finished. You have to understand the timing here. The Bell family has been dealing with their spirit for 3 years. 3 years of strange sounds, flying objects, and a voice that speaks to them in the dark. 3 years of neighbors coming by to witness the phenomenon. 3 years of building a reputation as the most haunted family in Tennessee. And now, right when things should be settling down, right when Betsy should be moving on to her own life, she breaks off her engagement to the one man everyone expected her to marry. The voice, of course, is delighted. Thank the Lord, the entity supposedly says when it hears the news. Betsy Bell will never be happy with Joshua Gardner. Now this is where the official story gets interesting, because according to the family's later accounts, the spirit has been pushing for this breakup for months. It's been whispering to Betsy at night, telling her that Joshua isn't right for her, promising that if she'll just listen, if she'll just trust the voice, everything will work out better. But here's what nobody talks about. Joshua Gardner isn't just some random suitor. He's not just the boy next door who caught Betsy's eye at a church social. Joshua Gardner is the son of a successful farmer. His family owns good land. More importantly, Joshua Gardner represents something the Bell family desperately needs right now: financial stability. Remember where we left off. John Bell is sick. The family's finances are strained. They're dealing with ongoing legal pressure from Kate Batts. And now their most marriageable daughter, their best chance at forming a beneficial alliance with another established family, suddenly calls off her engagement. You'd think someone would have asked Betsy what changed her mind. You'd think her parents would have pressed her for details. You'd think Joshua Gardner himself would have demanded an explanation. But the record is remarkably quiet about the actual reasons for the breakup. What we do have are the stories that came later. Stories about how the spirit warned Betsy away from Joshua. Stories about how the voice knew things about Joshua's character that no one else could have known. Stories about how the entity was protecting Betsy from making a terrible mistake. Convenient stories. Stories that make the spirit seem benevolent instead of destructive. But let's look at what actually happened in the weeks leading up to the broken engagement. February 1820. Kate Batts makes several trips to town. She's been doing this more frequently lately, traveling to Adams, spending time at the courthouse talking to people. The lawsuit against John Bell is still active, remember, still grinding through the legal system, and Kate Batts still needs allies. Now this is where we have to read between the lines, because nobody kept detailed records of who talked to whom during those cold February weeks. But think about the social dynamics at play. Joshua Gardner comes from a respected family. His father has influence. His opinion carries weight in the community. If Joshua marries into the Bell family, he becomes, by extension, a defender of the Bell family's reputation. That's not good for Kate Batts. That's another voice speaking against her in the ongoing dispute over the land deal and the slaves and the money that John Bell still owes her. But if Joshua Gardner could be convinced that the Bell family isn't what they seem, if he could be made to believe that there's something genuinely wrong with them, something unnatural and dangerous, well, that changes everything. A young man might overlook financial problems in a potential bride's family. He might even overlook legal troubles if he believes they'll be resolved. But supernatural harassment, demonic possession, the kind of spiritual contamination that might follow his own family for generations, that's harder to ignore. Here's where the timing gets really interesting. Because the voice that's been haunting the Bell family doesn't just know intimate details about their lives. It knows things about Joshua Gardner too. According to Betsy's later accounts, the spirit tells her things about Joshua that she never could have known otherwise. Private things, embarrassing things, things that make her question whether she really knows the man she's planning to marry. But how does a supernatural entity learn gossip about a young farmer in Robertson County, Tennessee? The answer might be simpler than you think. Small communities run on information. Everyone knows everyone else's business. The trick isn't gathering secrets, it's knowing which secrets to deploy and when. Kate Batts has lived in this community for decades. She's heard the talk at market days and church socials. She knows which families have money troubles and which ones are just pretending prosperity. She knows which young men have reputations for drinking or gambling or worse. And she certainly knows enough about Joshua Gardner to plant doubts in a young woman's mind. Now, I'm not saying Kate Batts was literally hiding in the Bell family's walls, whispering to Betsy in the dark. That's not how this works, but information has a way of traveling, especially when someone with motivation and intelligence is directing its flow. Think about the mechanics. Betsy is already unsettled by months of strange occurrences. She's already questioning everything she thought she knew about her family and her life. In that state of mind, any doubt about Joshua Gardner gets amplified. Any whispered rumor becomes a revelation. Any suggestion that maybe, just maybe, she's making a mistake becomes a certainty. And once Betsy starts having doubts, the voice can take credit for her intuition. "I told you so," the spirit can say. "Didn't I warn you? Aren't you glad you listened?" March 15, 1820. Betsy Bell ends her engagement to Joshua Gardner. The community is surprised but not devastated. These things happen, especially in families dealing with unusual circumstances. Joshua Gardner accepts the decision with dignity and eventually marries someone else. His family maintains their standing in the community. They remain prosperous and respected, but they are no longer connected to the Bell family, no longer obligated to defend them, no longer invested in their reputation or their version of events, which means Kate Batts has one less enemy to worry about as her legal case against John Bell moves forward. The spirit, meanwhile, is triumphant. It has successfully broken up a match that everyone expected to succeed. It has demonstrated its power to influence major family decisions. It has proven that its voice carries more weight than social expectations or financial considerations. But here's the question nobody asked at the time. What did the spirit get out of this victory? What did a supernatural entity gain by preventing Betsy Bell from marrying Joshua Gardner? The answer might depend on whether you believe in supernatural entities at all. Because while the Bell family is dealing with their broken engagement and their triumphant spirit, Kate Batts is preparing for the next phase of her legal battle. And now she has one fewer ally to worry about in the community that will ultimately judge whether John Bell has been dealing honestly with her. The voice that knew exactly how to break up Betsy Bell's engagement is about to demonstrate another convenient talent, an intimate knowledge of property law and financial transactions. Almost like it's been studying the case files. The voice knew things it shouldn't have known, not just the intimate details of the Bell family's daily routines, not just their financial struggles or Betsy's romantic troubles. The entity that supposedly haunted the Bell farm possessed knowledge that cut to the heart of every property dispute in Robertson County. It could recite boundary lines with the precision of a surveyor. It knew which deeds had been filed improperly, which witness signatures were questionable, which land grants overlapped in ways that created decades of legal headaches. And it used this knowledge like a weapon. The neighbors started talking in early 1818, not about ghosts, not yet, about the strange conversations they'd been having with members of the Bell family. Conversations where John Bell or one of his sons would casually mention property details that seemed oddly specific. Comments about survey markers that had been moved. Observations about which families had been filing quiet claims on abandoned lots. You have to understand the landscape they were operating in. Robertson County in 1818 was a maze of overlapping land claims, disputed boundaries, and families who'd been feuding over property lines for decades. The kind of place where knowing your neighbor's business wasn't just gossip, it was survival. And somehow, the Bell family had become remarkably well-informed about everyone's business. James Johnson owned the farm adjacent to the Bell property. He'd been locked in a boundary dispute with 3 different neighbors for over 2 years. The surveys didn't match. The original land grants contained contradictory descriptions. Johnson had spent a small fortune on legal fees and was no closer to resolution. Then, in March of 1818, he had a conversation with Richard Williams Bell that changed everything. According to Johnson's later testimony, yes, there was testimony, buried in county records that nobody talks about. Richard casually mentioned that Johnson's eastern boundary marker had been moved sometime in the previous fall. Moved by about 40 yards, which would cost Johnson nearly 6 acres of prime farmland. Johnson asked how Richard could possibly know this. Richard's answer was peculiar. He claimed the family's visitor, that's the word he used, visitor, had mentioned it during one of its nightly communications. The spirit, Richard explained, seemed to have an unusual interest in property matters. Johnson thought this was nonsense until he hired a surveyor to check. The marker had indeed been moved, recently, and Richard Bell had been absolutely correct about the distance. But here's the part that should bother you. Johnson's boundary dispute involved land that Kate Batts had owned before the Bell family acquired their property. Land that connected to the original parcel that John Bell had purchased under questionable circumstances. Land that, if properly surveyed, would have revealed the true scope of the Bell family's holdings. The voice wasn't just helpful to the Bell family. It was strategically helpful. It provided information that protected their interests while exposing the vulnerabilities of their neighbors. It knew which families were behind on their land payments. It could recite the terms of private agreements that had never been formally recorded. It understood the county's filing system better than most of the clerks who worked there. And it was remarkably selective about what it chose to reveal. Take the case of William Porter, who owned property south of the Bell farm. Porter had been quietly accumulating small parcels of land through tax sales and private purchases. Nothing illegal, but he hadn't advertised his activities. Porter was building towards something, maybe a larger farm, maybe speculation on future development. The Bell family's supernatural visitor took a keen interest in Porter's business dealings. It could describe his recent purchases with remarkable accuracy. It knew which properties he'd bid on unsuccessfully. It even seemed to understand his financing arrangements with merchants in Nashville. This information found its way into conversations throughout the community, always indirectly. Always presented as curious observations from the Bell family's otherworldly guest, never as accusations or threats, just interesting details that happened to come up in casual conversation. Porter's land deals became much more expensive after word spread about his activities. Other buyers emerged, driving up prices. Private sellers became reluctant to negotiate. Within 6 months, Porter had abandoned his expansion plans and eventually sold several of his recent purchases at a loss. Nobody drew a direct connection between the Bell family's supernatural communications and Porter's business problems, but the timing was precise. The voice demonstrated other convenient knowledge. It could identify which families were considering selling their property. It knew who was struggling with debt and might be forced into quick sales. It understood which land parcels had unclear titles that could be challenged in court. This wasn't the kind of information that ghosts typically possess. This was the kind of intelligence that required careful observation, detailed record-keeping, and possibly access to county filing systems. The kind of information that could give someone a significant advantage in a community where land was the primary source of wealth. And there was another pattern that nobody wanted to acknowledge. The families who received unwelcome attention from the Bell family's supernatural visitor, families like Kate Batts, like William Porter, like several others whose names appear in county records, all shared something in common. They had been involved, directly or indirectly, in property transactions that affected the Bell family's interests. They owned land that bordered Bell property. They had information about the history of parcels that John Bell had acquired. They represented potential challenges to the Bell family's version of events. The voice that haunted the Bell farm wasn't just knowledgeable about property law. It was systematically targeting people who posed threats to the Bell family's carefully constructed land empire. But the most damning detail is this: the supernatural entity never revealed information that would have damaged the Bell family's interests, never exposed John Bell's questionable business practices, never mentioned the timing of Kate Batts' financial collapse, never drew attention to the convenient gaps in property records that favored the Bell family's claims. For a spirit that seemed obsessed with property disputes and legal technicalities, it maintained remarkable discretion about certain subjects. Draw your own conclusions about what kind of ghost possesses detailed knowledge of county land records, but maintains perfect loyalty to a single family's financial interests. About what kind of supernatural entity can recite survey measurements, but never mentions the circumstances under which those surveys were originally conducted. The voice knew too much about property lines and too little about justice. And in Robertson County, Tennessee, in 1818, that combination was about to prove deadly for John Bell himself. December 20th, 1820. John Bell wakes up feeling strange, not sick exactly, just off. His tongue feels thick. His hands shake when he reaches for his coffee. Lucy asks if he's all right. He says he's fine. He's not fine. By noon, John Bell can barely stand. His speech slurs, his vision blurs. Lucy sends Richard to fetch the doctor, but everyone in Adams, Tennessee knows what this looks like. They've seen it before in other families, other disputes. The timing, though. You have to appreciate the timing. John Bell has spent 3 years fighting the Bell Witch. 3 years of his family being terrorized by voices in the walls, objects flying through rooms, his daughter Betsy screaming in the night. 3 years of neighbors gathering to witness the spectacle. 3 years of his reputation crumbling, his finances bleeding out, his health deteriorating under the constant stress. And now, just as the haunting reaches its crescendo, just as the community has turned completely against him, just as Kate Batts has won her lawsuit and destroyed his standing in the county, John Bell starts dying. The official story goes like this: the Bell Witch poisoned him. The family found a mysterious vial of dark liquid in the medicine cabinet. When they gave a drop to the cat died instantly. The witch's voice cackled through the house, claiming credit for the murder. But here's what nobody talks about. John Bell's symptoms don't match poison. They match something else entirely. Dr. George Hobson treats John Bell through his final illness. Hobson knows poison cases. He's seen arsenic poisoning, mercury poisoning, plant alkaloid poisoning. He's familiar with the symptoms, the progression, the telltale signs. John Bell's condition doesn't fit any of them. The man suffers from facial paralysis, difficulty swallowing, muscle weakness that spreads from his face downward. His mind stays clear even as his body fails. These aren't poison symptoms, they're stroke symptoms. Or potentially something neurological that 1820 medicine can't identify or treat. But the family needs a different story. They need the Bell witch to be responsible. Because if John Bell dies of natural causes, if he simply succumbs to 3 years of stress and possible underlying health conditions, then the haunting becomes just another family falling apart under pressure. The witch has to kill him. Otherwise, what was the point of any of it? Here's the part that should bother you. The mysterious poison vial that supposedly killed John Bell, nobody preserves it for analysis. Nobody keeps it as evidence. Nobody even describes it in detail. It just appears in the story, like a prop placed on stage at exactly the right moment. Richard Williams Bell, writing decades later, claims the family found this vial among John Bell's medicines. Claims they tested it on the cat. Claims the cat died instantly, proving the witch's guilt. But Richard is 11 years old when his father dies. His memories of that day are filtered through decades of retelling, decades of shaping the story into something more dramatic than simple illness. You know what's convenient about poison? It explains everything while proving nothing. John Bell dies, the witch takes credit, and the family gets to be victims instead of participants in their father's destruction. The cat story bothers me the most. Not because I doubt they tested the vial on an animal, that's exactly what people would do in 1820, but because it's the perfect detail. Too perfect, think about it. The family finds a mysterious poison, they test it on the cat. The cat dies instantly. The witch confesses to murder. It's a complete narrative circle tied up with a bow, but John Bell doesn't die instantly. He lingers for days, gradually weakening, gradually losing the ability to speak and swallow. If the same poison that killed a cat instantly is slowly killing John Bell, why the different timeline? Why the different symptoms? Unless the vial and the cat and the witch's confession are theatre, a performance designed to give meaning to a man's natural death. Richard Bell will spend the rest of his life telling this story. He'll write it down, publish it, lecture about it. The Bell Witch will become his identity, his claim to fame, his contribution to Tennessee folklore. But Richard is a child when it happens. Children process trauma differently. They fill in gaps with imagination. They create explanations that make sense of chaos. They remember what adults tell them to remember. And the adults in Richard's life need John Bell's death to mean something. They need the 3 years of haunting to culminate in something more dramatic than a middle-aged man's body finally giving out under stress. So they give him poison. They give him a villain. They give him a story that transforms a sad, ordinary death into supernatural murder. John Bell dies on December 20th, 1820. The next morning, the Bell Witch speaks one final time. According to the family, the voice announces its satisfaction with John Bell's death and declares its intention to leave, though it promises to return in 7 years to visit Andrew Jackson. How convenient. The witch completes its mission exactly when John Bell's natural life ends. No loose ends. No unfinished business. just a supernatural entity that arrives when the family needs a scapegoat and departs when the primary target is eliminated. But here's what nobody asks. If the Bell Witch was powerful enough to poison John Bell, why did it take 3 years? Why the elaborate haunting? Why terrorize the whole family instead of just killing the man it supposedly wanted dead? Unless the haunting was never about killing John Bell. Unless it was about destroying his reputation, isolating his family, and preparing the community to accept his death as supernatural justice rather than human tragedy. The neighbors buy the story completely. John Bell, the man who cheated Kate Batts, who took her land through legal manipulation, who destroyed a widow's livelihood, that man got what he deserved. The Bell Witch delivered cosmic justice. Nobody questions the poison story. Nobody demands to see the vial. Nobody asks why John Bell's symptoms don't match any known poison. They're too relieved to have an explanation that makes sense of 3 years of chaos. Kate Batts has won. Not just the lawsuit, not just the land, but the complete destruction of John Bell's legacy. He dies not as a respected farmer who suffered a stroke, but as a villain punished by supernatural forces for his crimes against a helpless woman. The story writes itself, and once it's written, once the community accepts it, there's no going back to examine the evidence. But the poison story that closes the Bell Witch case, it's about to fall apart under scrutiny. Because when you look at what John Bell actually ingested in his final days, when you examine who had access to his medicine, when you trace the timeline of his symptoms against the family's changing story, you realize the most famous murder in American ghost lore might not be murder at all. The story everyone remembers about John Bell's death is the poison story. You know, the one, the mysterious vial that appeared after he died, the voice claiming credit, the liquid that killed the cat when they tested it. It's the centerpiece of every Bell Witch retelling. The smoking gun that proves supernatural murder, except the poison story comes from exactly one source. Richard Williams Bell, writing 30 years after his father's death. And when you actually examine what he wrote, the timeline falls apart like wet paper. Here's what Richard claimed happened. December 20th, 1820, his father John Bell dies after months of illness. The family is gathered around the deathbed. After John passes, they're searching through his belongings and find a small vial of dark liquid they'd never seen before. Nobody knows where it came from. Then the voice, Kate, the Bell Witch, speaks up and says she gave John Bell that poison, that she's the one who killed him. To test the liquid, they give a few drops to the family cat. The cat goes into convulsions and dies within minutes. Proof positive that the liquid was lethal poison. Then they throw the vial into the fireplace where it burns with a bright blue flame and fills the room with an awful stench. Dramatic story. Supernatural murder weapon. Case closed. But here's the part that should bother you. Richard is the only person who ever mentions this vial. Not his mother, Lucy. Not his siblings, not Dr. George Hobson, who was treating John Bell for months and was present at the death. Not the neighbors who were constantly at the Bell house during those final weeks. Just Richard 30 years later, when everyone else who could contradict him was dead. You want to know what Dr. Hobson actually recorded about John Bell's death? Chronic illness. Months of decline. Swelling in his tongue and throat that made it difficult for him to eat or speak. Classic symptoms of what they'd now recognize as a stroke or heart condition. Nothing sudden, nothing mysterious. Nothing that required supernatural explanation. But Richard needed something more dramatic for his book. The real story, sick man dies of illness after months of decline, doesn't sell copies, doesn't make your family famous, doesn't turn your property into a tourist destination. So where does the poison story really come from? Folk medicine, that's what nobody talks about when they repeat Richard's tale. In 1820, rural Tennessee families kept all sorts of tinctures and home remedies, mercury compounds for various ailments, laudanum for pain, plant extracts that could be lethal in the wrong doses. Every frontier household had substances that would kill a cat if you gave them enough. The Bell family would have had a medicine chest full of potentially dangerous liquids. Finding an unmarked vial after John Bell's death wouldn't have been mysterious, it would have been typical. Families didn't label everything. They didn't keep detailed inventories. And with John Bell sick for months, Lucy Bell would have been trying every folk remedy she could find. But Richard's version requires you to believe that this vial just appeared, materialized out of thin air. No natural explanation possible. Here's another problem with the poison story, the timing. According to Richard, they found the vial immediately after John Bell died. Then they tested it on the cat. Then they threw it in the fire. All on December 20th, 1820. But Dr. Hobson's records show that John Bell's final illness lasted weeks. He was bedridden, barely able to swallow. If someone was poisoning him, they'd been doing it slowly over time. A single vial wouldn't explain months of decline. And here's the detail that really bothers me, the blue flame. Richard claims that when they threw the vial into the fire, it burned with a bright blue flame and terrible smell. You know what burns blue? Alcohol. You know what frontier families used as a base for medicinal tinctures? Alcohol. Richard took a perfectly normal medicine bottle, probably something Lucy Bell had been using to treat her husband's symptoms, and turned it into evidence of supernatural murder. The blue flame that proves otherworldly poison is actually just proof that this was a standard alcohol-based remedy. But the most telling detail is what happens next in Richard's story. After they burn the mysterious vial, the Bell witch voice speaks up and takes credit for the murder. Says she gave John Bell that poison. Says she's finally gotten her revenge. Convenient, right? The voice that only the Bell family ever heard confirms that the death was supernatural murder. No outside investigation needed. No questions about motive or method. The ghost confessed. Except remember, by 1820, the Bell witch voice had been accusing John Bell of cheating Kate Batts for 3 years. Everyone in Robertson County knew the accusations. Everyone knew Kate Batts blamed John Bell for her financial ruin. If John Bell died under suspicious circumstances, people might start asking uncomfortable questions about those land deals. But if the death was supernatural murder, if the Bell witch did it, then nobody looks too closely at the human motives. Nobody investigates the financial disputes. Nobody asks why John Bell's family kept getting richer while Kate Batts lost everything. The poison story doesn't just explain John Bell's death, it deflects attention from anyone who might have had earthly reasons to want him dead. You know, if you're still listening at this point, you're one of us. Hit subscribe. We uncover a new American mystery every single night. Now, I'm not saying Richard Bell deliberately invented the poison story. Maybe he genuinely remembered finding a mysterious vial. Memory is funny, especially when you're writing about traumatic events decades later. Maybe his mother did have an unmarked bottle of medicine that looked suspicious in hindsight. Maybe the cat really did die after drinking something it shouldn't have, but the supernatural confession, the voice taking credit for murder. That's storytelling, not memory. That's a family that needed to control the narrative about their father's death. That needed to make sure nobody looked too closely at the very real, very human conflicts that had been tearing Robertson County apart for years. Because here's what nobody talks about when they retell the Bell Witch story: John Bell died wealthy. Despite all the supernatural harassment, despite years of the witch supposedly tormenting his family, despite the claims that the entity was driving them toward ruin, John Bell's estate was substantial when he passed. The man Kate Batts accused of cheating her out of her land died owning more property than when the haunting started. His family inherited a fortune built on those disputed land deals. And the woman who'd been fighting him in court for years, Kate Batts, was destitute by 1820. Broken. Forgotten. The poison story isn't evidence of supernatural murder. It's evidence of how thoroughly the Bell family controlled the narrative about their haunting. They turned their victim's death into proof of their innocence. They made Kate Batts disappear from her own revenge story. And they made sure that for the next 200 years, when people talked about the Bell Witch, they'd remember a mysterious poison vial and a ghostly confession. Not a land dispute, not a woman destroyed by legal manipulation. Not the very human motives that actually explain everything. But Richard Bell wasn't done controlling the story. The poison tale was just the beginning, because after his father died, Richard had to explain how he knew so much about the witch's private conversations, how he remembered exact quotes from events that happened when he was a child, how he became the definitive source for a story that dozens of other people had lived through. The answer to that question reveals the most sophisticated part of the Bell family's long con. And it starts with understanding how Richard Bell became America's first ghost writer, literally. By 1894, Richard Williams Bell had a problem. His family's ghost story was dying, not the haunting itself, that was long over. John Bell had been dead for 73 years. Kate Batts was buried somewhere outside Adams, Tennessee, her grave unmarked and forgotten. The voices had been silent for decades. But the story was fading from memory. And Richard Bell needed it to live forever. You have to understand what was at stake here. The Bell family had spent the better part of the 1820s and 1830s dining out on their ghost story. Literally, visitors came from hundreds of miles away to hear first-hand accounts of the Bell Witch. They paid for meals, they paid for lodging, they brought gifts and left donations. But by the 1890s, most of the original witnesses were dead. The few neighbors still alive had moved on with their lives. Some had even started telling different versions that didn't always flatter the Bell family. Richard Bell was the youngest Bell child during the haunting. He'd been barely 10 years old when it started, maybe 14 when it ended. But he was also the family's natural storyteller, and more importantly, he could read and write better than most of his siblings. So in 1894, at the age of 77, Richard Bell decided to write a book. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Richard didn't just write down what he remembered from childhood. He created what might be the first piece of American supernatural fiction disguised as memoir. He called it Our Family Trouble, and trouble it was for anyone trying to separate fact from fiction. Richard Bell wrote with the authority of an eyewitness, but he was describing events that supposedly happened when he was a child. He quoted conversations verbatim from 70 years earlier. He provided precise dates for incidents that had never been recorded at the time. Most tellingly, he wrote about private family conversations that supposedly took place when he wasn't in the room. How does a 10-year-old boy know what his father said to his mother in their bedroom at midnight? The answer is simple: he made it up. But Richard Bell was smart about his fiction. He didn't invent outrageous new supernatural events. Instead, he took the skeleton of the family's oral tradition and fleshed it out with literary techniques that wouldn't be out of place in a Gothic novel. He gave the Bell Witch a consistent personality, spiteful, profane, oddly knowledgeable about local gossip. He created dramatic dialogue for every family member. He structured the haunting like a 3-act play, complete with rising action, climax, and resolution. Most importantly, he solved the story's biggest logical problems by inventing explanations that couldn't be verified or disproven. Take the Andrew Jackson visit, for instance. Local oral tradition had always been vague about whether Old Hickory actually came to the Bell farm. Some said yes, some said no, most said they weren't sure. Richard Bell didn't just confirm the visit, he wrote an entire chapter about it, complete with dialogue between Jackson and the Bell Witch. He described Jackson's soldiers. He provided specific dates. He even quoted what Jackson supposedly said afterward. The problem is that none of it matches Jackson's documented movements during that period. Jackson was campaigning in Florida when Richard Bell claims he was ghost hunting in Tennessee. But by 1894, Jackson had been dead for 50 years. Who was going to fact-check a ghost story? Here's what really bothers me about Richard Bell's book. He wrote extensively about his family's suffering during the haunting. He described his mother's terror, his sister Betsy's torment, his father's declining health. But he wrote almost nothing about Kate Batts, the woman who lost her land, her lawsuit, and eventually her life gets maybe 3 paragraphs in the entire book. Richard Bell mentions her name exactly twice. He never explains why the Bell Witch supposedly hated his father. He never mentions the property dispute that started everything. In Richard Bell's version, Kate Batts simply doesn't exist as anything more than a footnote. Our Family Trouble was published in 1896. It was an immediate success, at least by local standards. Richard Bell sold copies at general stores throughout Middle Tennessee. He gave readings at churches and community halls. He even sold copies by mail to curiosity seekers as far away as New York and California. More importantly, his book became the definitive version of the Bell Witch story. Every subsequent telling, in newspapers, magazines, and other books, traced back to Richard Bell's 1896 account. Which means that the version of the Bell Witch haunting you've probably heard is the version a 79-year-old man wrote down 80 years after the fact, based on childhood memories of a family cover-up. Richard Bell lived until 1903. He spent his final years as something like a local celebrity, the last living witness to America's most famous ghost story. Visitors still came to Adams, Tennessee, looking for Bell Witch stories, and Richard was happy to provide them. He gave interviews to newspaper reporters. He sold signed copies of his book. He even took tourists on walks around the old Bell property, pointing out locations where supernatural events had supposedly occurred. But here's what those visitors didn't know. The property Richard Bell was showing them wasn't even the right property. The original Bell farm had been sold and subdivided multiple times since the 1820s. The house where the haunting supposedly occurred had been torn down decades earlier. The family cemetery had been relocated. Richard Bell was essentially giving tour of a stage set, pointing to random locations and assigning them supernatural significance. But the tourists didn't care. They wanted to believe they were standing where the Bell Witch had tormented a frontier family. And Richard Bell was happy to let them believe it. The irony is perfect. A story that began as an elaborate deception to cover up a property dispute ended as an elaborate tourist attraction built on false locations. Richard Bell died in 1903, taking with him any chance of learning what really happened during those years in Adams, Tennessee. His book remained the authoritative account. His version became history, but books have a way of outlasting their authors. And sometimes, if you read carefully enough, you can find the truth hidden between the lines of fiction. Because Richard Bell may have been America's first ghost writer, but he made one crucial mistake. He wrote his book for people who didn't know the area, didn't know the families, didn't know the real history. He never expected anyone to go looking for the cave where it all started. After John Bell died and the spirit supposedly departed, one place remained: the cave on the Bell property. The cave where Richard Bell claimed it all began. The cave where, according to his later writings, the family first heard those mysterious sounds that would make them famous across Tennessee and beyond. But here's what Richard never mentioned in his ghost stories. That cave wasn't just some random geological formation where supernatural forces happened to gather. It was a limestone cavern that had been used by settlers in the area since the 1790s. And more importantly, it had been part of the original property dispute between John Bell and Kate Batts. The cave sat right on the boundary line that had been contested in court. Remember that lawsuit Kate Batts filed, the one about the land boundaries and the slave trade deal gone wrong? Part of her claim involved access rights to that cave. Settlers used caves like this for cold storage, for shelter during storms, for hiding valuables. Control of the cave meant control of a valuable resource. Now, Richard Bell's version has the family discovering strange sounds coming from deep in the cave. Knockings, scratchings, the beginning of their supernatural ordeal. But nobody ever asked why sounds from a cave would be so unusual in the first place. Caves make sounds, water drips, wind whistles through passages, small animals nest in the darkness. What makes more sense? That the Bell Cave was genuinely haunted, or that someone who knew the property well was using it as a base of operations? Someone who understood exactly how sound carried from the cave to the main house. Someone who knew the family's routines, their comings and goings, their vulnerabilities. Kate Batts had lived in the area for decades. She knew every inch of that land, including the cave system. And after losing her lawsuit, after watching John Bell essentially steal property she believed was rightfully hers, she had every reason to make his life uncomfortable. The cave provided the perfect staging area. Think about the logistics of the Bell Witch haunting. The sounds always seemed to know exactly when the family was home. The voice could predict visitors, knew private conversations, understood property disputes in detail. That kind of intelligence gathering requires proximity. It requires someone watching, listening, learning the family's patterns. A cave connected to the property by underground passages would explain how someone could observe the Bell house without being seen. How they could appear and disappear so mysteriously. how they knew things that seemed impossible for an outsider to know. The Bell family claimed the cave was where it all started, but they never explained why they didn't simply seal it up. If you truly believed supernatural forces were emanating from a hole in the ground on your property, wouldn't your first instinct be to block it? Fill it with stones, board it over. Instead, they left it open. They even took visitors there as part of the ghost story tour. That's because the cave wasn't the source of their problems, it was evidence. Evidence of how someone could have orchestrated the entire haunting without ever being caught. Local stories, the ones that didn't make it into Richard Bell's official account, mention finding signs of habitation in the cave after the haunting ended. Cold fire pits, places where someone had clearly been spending time, marks on the walls that looked deliberately made. Nobody investigated too closely, of course. The Bell family had already decided on their supernatural explanation, and the community was ready to move on. But here's the detail that should bother you. After John Bell died and the Bell Witch supposedly left forever, the cave remained active. Not with supernatural activity, but with very human visitors. People reported seeing lights in the cave at night, hearing voices that carried up from the depths. Always female voices, according to the stories that survived. Kate Batts lived until 1837, 16 years after the Bell Witch supposedly departed. 16 years during which she remained in the area, watching the family that had destroyed her reputation and stolen her property. The official histories paint her as disappearing after the lawsuit, but property records show she maintained holdings in Robertson County until her death. She was still there, still angry. Still using whatever means, she had to remind the Bell family that their victory had come at a price. The cave itself tells a story that Richard Bell never wanted preserved. Geological surveys done in the 1900s revealed multiple entrances, including one that opened near the road between the Bell property and Kate Batts' former holdings. Natural passages that connected underground for nearly half a mile. A perfect network for someone who needed to move unseen. Modern visitors to the site, the ones who bother to explore beyond the tourist version, still find evidence of long-term human habitation. Not from the 1800s, but older, Native American artifacts, colonial-era items, and yes, things that date to the 1820s. Personal items that someone left behind when they finally stopped coming to the cave. You want to know what really happened in that cave? Someone used it as a base to wage a campaign of psychological warfare against the Bell family. Someone who understood that in 1820s Tennessee, accusations of witchcraft were still powerful weapons. Someone who knew that the right combination of sounds, voices, and mysterious events could destroy a family's reputation as effectively as any lawsuit. The Bell Witch haunting ended when John Bell died, but the cave remained. Kate Batts remained. And for 16 more years, until her death in 1837, she had access to a perfect vantage point for watching the family that had taken everything from her. The question isn't whether the cave was supernatural. The question is how long Kate Batts continued to use it, and what else she might have accomplished from those limestone depths that never made it into Richard Bell's ghost stories. But Kate Batts wasn't done with her revenge. Even after the haunting supposedly ended, even after John Bell was dead and buried, she had 16 more years to settle scores. And the way she spent those final years tells us everything about what the Bell Witch haunting really cost her. Kate Batts died on March 15, 1831. Alone in her cabin, no family at her bedside, no neighbors to witness her final breath. The woman who'd spent 14 years fighting for her land, who'd taken on John Bell and his entire family, who'd watched them spin her legitimate grievances into ghost stories, she died forgotten. You want to know something that should bother you? There's no record of her funeral, no mention in the church records, no obituary in any Tennessee paper. Kate Batts, the woman whose name became synonymous with supernatural vengeance, simply disappeared from history the moment she stopped breathing. But here's where it gets strange. The very week Kate died, Richard Williams Bell started writing his book. The timing wasn't coincidental. Richard had been waiting, watching, making sure Kate couldn't contradict his version of events. You have to understand what Kate's death meant for the Bell family. For 14 years, she'd been the one person who could expose their hoax, the only living witness who knew the real story behind their haunting. Every time someone repeated the ghost tales, Kate was still out there, still dangerous, still capable of telling anyone who'd listen about the lawsuit, the land disputes, the systematic campaign to destroy her reputation. Now she was gone. The records show Kate was buried in the old Robertson County Cemetery. Simple pine barks, no headstone. The grave marker, when they finally put one up years later, got her name wrong, listed her as Catherine Betts. Even in death, they couldn't get her story straight, but here's what nobody talks about. Kate's cabin didn't stay empty long. Within 2 months of her death, someone had claimed the property. Guess who filed the paperwork? Jesse Bell, John's youngest son. The same family that had spent over a decade claiming Kate's spirit was tormenting them swooped in to take her land the moment she died. The property she'd fought so hard to keep, the cabin where she'd lived out her final, isolated years, they turned it into a storage shed. Now here's the part that should really bother you. Kate's death wasn't just convenient for the Bells, it was profitable. Because 1831 was the year the Bell Witch story started spreading beyond Robertson County. Richard's manuscript was making the rounds. Neighbors were sharing their memories of the haunting. Visitors were starting to show up at the old Bell property, wanting to hear about the famous ghost. Kate had spent her final years watching her name become a tourist attraction, watching strangers come to gawk at the place where she'd supposedly terrorized a family, listening to people repeat stories about her supernatural vengeance while she sat in her cabin, very much alive, very much forgotten. The real Kate Batts, the woman who'd filed legitimate lawsuits, who'd fought for her property rights, who'd been systematically destroyed by a coordinated family hoax. That woman died with her reputation in ruins. But the fictional Kate Batts, the vengeful witch spirit, she was just getting started. You want to know what Kate's neighbors said about her final years? The few who bothered to mention her at all described a broken woman, someone who'd stopped fighting, stopped talking about the land disputes, stopped trying to defend herself against the ghost stories. According to the church records, the only place her real name appears in those final years, Kate had requested prayer for those who had borne false witness. The preacher noted that she seemed to carry a great burden of injustice. She knew exactly what the Bell family had done to her, and she knew she'd never be able to prove it. Kate's final years were spent in poverty. The legal battles had drained whatever resources she'd had. The social isolation meant no one would hire her for work or buy goods from her. She survived on charity from the few church members who still remembered Christian duty. Meanwhile, the Bell family was rebuilding their reputation. John Bell Jr., had married well. Jessie was expanding the family land holdings. Richard was positioning himself as the family historian, the keeper of their supernatural legacy. They'd won, completely and utterly. The morning Kate died, a neighbor found her door standing open. She'd been dead for at least 2 days before anyone noticed. The woman who'd once been feared enough to inspire America's most famous ghost story had died so alone that her passing went unobserved. But here's what that same neighbor remembered years later, when the Bell Witch tour started coming through. Kate's final words, according to the woman who'd occasionally brought her food, were about the truth. "They'll make me famous for all the wrong reasons," Kate had whispered during her final illness. "But someday, someone will ask the right questions." Kate Batts was buried on a Thursday morning. 3 people attended her funeral: the preacher who'd prayed for her burden of injustice, the neighbor who'd found her body, and one other mourner, someone the neighbor described as a woman from the next county who said she'd known Kate as a girl. No one from the Bell family came to pay their respects to the woman whose spirit had made them famous. The irony should make your skin crawl. Kate Batts, the real woman, died forgotten and friendless. But Kate Batts the witch, she was about to become immortal. Within a week of Kate's death, the property transfers were complete. The Bell family owned every acre Kate had fought for. The land disputes that had sparked 14 years of supernatural theatre were finally settled. And with Kate's voice permanently silenced, Richard Bell could tell whatever version of the story he wanted. Which is exactly what he did, because the Bell Witch was about to become America's first mass-marketed ghost story. The family that had destroyed Kate Batts was about to make her famous worldwide. You're going to want to hear what happened next. By 1870, something strange was happening in Adams, Tennessee. Visitors started showing up. Not many at first, just the occasional curious traveler who'd heard whispers in Nashville or Memphis about the Bell Farm and its famous ghost. But word was spreading. The Bell family was long gone by then. Richard Bell had taken his ghost story and his book Prophets and disappeared into obscurity. The original farmhouse had been torn down, rebuilt, torn down again. But the cave remained. That limestone hollow where, according to Richard's carefully crafted narrative, the Bell Witch had first emerged to torment his family. The locals noticed the pattern first, strangers asking directions to the Bell place. City folks with clean boots and curious expressions wanting to know about the witch. Some carried copies of Richard Bell's book, that thin volume of family mythology he'd published years earlier. They'd read about the cave, about the sounds, about the supernatural terror that had supposedly driven John Bell to his grave. And here's where it gets interesting. Nobody was correcting the story anymore. Kate Batts was dead. Had been for years. The woman who could have told the real story about the land dispute, about the legal battles, about a family's calculated campaign to destroy her reputation. She was buried in an unmarked grave. The neighbors who might have remembered the truth, they were either gone or keeping quiet. Some of them were making money off the visitors. Margaret Porter was one of the first. She'd lived near the Bell Farm as a child, claimed to remember the manifestations. For a quarter, she'd tell visitors about the night she heard the witch screaming. For 50 cents, she'd walk them to the cave entrance. She never mentioned Kate Batts, never brought up the lawsuit. Her version matched Richard Bell's book exactly. Word of mouth is a powerful thing in a region where entertainment was scarce and ghost stories were free. The Bell Witch tale had everything people wanted: supernatural, terror, family drama, mysterious voices from beyond. It was the perfect campfire story. And unlike most ghost stories, this one had a location, a place you could visit. The story evolved in the telling. Details that didn't exist in Richard Bell's original account started appearing. The witch became more violent, more dramatic. The manifestations grew more elaborate. Local storytellers added flourishes. The witch could throw furniture, could slap people across the face, could predict the future. Each telling made the legend bigger, stranger, more compelling. By 1880, the Bell Witch had become Robertson County's most famous export. Local newspapers started printing articles about the historic haunting. Hotels in nearby Nashville advertised their proximity to the supernatural site. Guidebooks mentioned the Bell Farm as a point of interest for tourists exploring Middle Tennessee. That's when the landowners got smart. The property that had once been the Bell Farm changed hands several times, but by the 1880s, it belonged to a man named James Byans. Byans had heard the stories, seen the steady trickle of visitors. He started charging admission to visit the cave, 25 cents to walk through the limestone passages where the Bell Witch supposedly originated. Byans would guide small groups through the narrow tunnels, pointing out formations that looked like faces in the rock, spots where the temperature dropped unexpectedly. He'd pause at certain locations and whisper about the sounds people claimed to hear: scratching, breathing, voices echoing from deep in the earth. The cave tour became a ritual. Visitors would arrive in carriages from Nashville, spend the night at local boarding houses, take the cave tour in the morning, and head home with stories to tell. Some claimed they heard things during their visit: unexplained sounds, whispers, sudden cold spots. Others reported feeling watched, followed, touched by invisible hands. Were they experiencing something supernatural? Or were they experiencing the power of suggestion, the psychological pressure of being in a dark cave while hearing a carefully crafted ghost story? Draw your own conclusions, but the reports were consistent enough to keep people coming. Some visitors documented their experiences. Sarah Mitchell, a Nashville socialite, wrote in her diary about her 1884 visit. The cave itself is unremarkable, but there is something about the place that unsettles the nerves. Whether from the stories one hears beforehand or some genuine atmospheric disturbance, I cannot say. But I was grateful to emerge into sunlight. Others were more skeptical. A traveling journalist from Memphis described his tour as an exercise in rustic theater, complete with strategically placed drafts and hidden assistants making mysterious sounds. But even the skeptics had to admit the cave was effectively spooky. By 1890, the Bell Witch had become Tennessee's first documented tourist trap. Local entrepreneurs expanded the offerings. They opened a small museum in Adams featuring artifacts from the Bell family, furniture that may or may not have been thrown by supernatural forces, personal items that may or may not have belonged to the original family. A local woman started selling Bell Witch protection charms, small cloth bags filled with herbs that supposedly kept malevolent spirits at bay. The irony was perfect. A story that began as an elaborate revenge plot against Kate Batts had transformed into a money-making enterprise. The Bell family's campaign to destroy one woman's reputation had evolved into a cottage industry built on supernatural tourism. The railroad helped. When the Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis Railway extended service through Robertson County, it became easier for visitors to reach the Bell Witch site. The railway company, recognizing a marketing opportunity, included the haunting in their promotional materials. Visit historic Middle Tennessee, home of the famous Bell Witch manifestations. But here's what nobody talks about. In all the tourist guides, all the newspaper articles, all the promotional materials from this period, Kate Batts is never mentioned. The woman at the center of the original conflict, the person whose life was destroyed by the Bell family's machinations, had been completely erased from the narrative. The few locals who remembered the real story kept quiet. There was money involved now. Tourism meant jobs, meant visitors spending money on food and lodging and souvenirs. Why complicate a profitable ghost story with messy details about property disputes and family vendettas? The transformation was complete. What started as targeted harassment had become folklore. What began as a calculated attack on Kate Batts had evolved into Tennessee's most enduring supernatural legend. The Bell Witch was no longer a tool of revenge, it was a brand. And that brand was about to go national. By 1920, the Bell Witch had become Tennessee's most profitable ghost story. Tour buses rolled into Adams County every weekend. Families packed picnic lunches to visit the cave where it all supposedly started. Local guides spun tales for a nickel, each version more dramatic than the last. Nobody mentioned Kate Batts anymore. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It took decades of careful forgetting, strategic omissions, and the simple human tendency to prefer a good ghost story over an ugly truth about property theft and family revenge. Richard Williams Bell's book had done its job. The lawsuit records gathered dust in courthouse basements. The land dispute that started everything became just another boring legal matter that nobody wanted to hear about. But here's what should bother you about how Tennessee turned this story into legend. They didn't just forget Kate Batts, they actively erased her. Local historians writing about the Bell Witch in the 1890s and early 1900s had access to the same court records we can read today. They knew about the lawsuit. They knew about the land dispute. They knew Kate Batts was a real woman with a real grievance against John Bell. They chose not to mention it. Why? Because ghost stories sell better than stories about stolen land. Supernatural revenge is more palatable than actual revenge. A mysterious entity from beyond the grave doesn't make you question your neighbors, your legal system, or the men who founded your community. The Bell Witch Cave became a legitimate tourist destination. The current owners installed electric lights, built walkways, added a gift shop. They printed brochures with Richard's version of events. No mention of Kate Batts, no mention of the lawsuit, just a mysterious supernatural force that tormented an innocent family for reasons nobody could explain. Perfect, clean, sellable. The local Chamber of Commerce loved it. Adams County had been struggling economically since the Civil War. Cotton prices were down. Young people were leaving for the cities. But ghost tourism, that was money you could count on. Families would drive from Nashville, from Memphis, from as far away as Louisville, just to see where America's most famous haunting occurred. You want to know how thoroughly they buried the real story? By 1930, the local newspaper was running annual Halloween features about the Bell Witch, ghost story contests for children, historical society presentations about the supernatural heritage of Robertson County. They turned Kate Batts's revenge into a civic celebration. The irony would be funny if it weren't so calculated. Here was a woman who lost her land, lost her lawsuit, lost her reputation, and died forgotten. And the community that destroyed her now profited from her story, after editing out every trace of what actually happened to her. But legends have a way of evolving, and the Bell Witch story kept growing. Each generation added new details. The voice became more articulate, more supernatural, more impossible. The physical manifestations became more dramatic. John Bell's death became more mysterious. Betsy's torment became more severe. And with each embellishment, the real story moved further from reach. By the 1950s, paranormal investigators were visiting the cave with electromagnetic equipment. They recorded strange sounds, measured temperature drops, documented unexplained phenomena. Which is interesting, because caves are naturally cold, naturally echo, and naturally create acoustic anomalies that can fool even sophisticated recording equipment. But here's what those investigators never did. They never went to the courthouse, never pulled the lawsuit records, never researched Kate Batts, never questioned why a supernatural entity would be so obsessed with property boundaries and land rights. Because that's not what they were there for. They were there for the ghost story. The mystery, the supernatural thrill that sells books and television specials and weekend getaways. The truth was just inconvenient paperwork gathering dust in filing cabinets. Tennessee's Tourism Board eventually got involved. Official state brochures featured the Bell Witch story. Highway markers directed visitors to the cave. The Robertson County Historical Society published pamphlets with Richard Bell's version of events, now treated as established historical fact. Nobody fact-checked a ghost story. And that's how you bury the truth, not through some grand conspiracy or government cover-up. Just through collective agreement that the entertaining version is better than the complicated one. That supernatural mystery is preferable to human cruelty. That a good story shouldn't be ruined by inconvenient facts. The final insult came in the 1970s when the Bell Witch story was adapted for television, radio, and eventually the internet. Each adaptation moved further from the source material. The Bell family became more sympathetic. John Bell became more innocent. The supernatural elements became more elaborate. Kate Batts disappeared entirely. You can visit the Bell Witch Cave today. Take the tour, buy the t-shirt. Listen to the guide explain how a mysterious supernatural force tormented an innocent farming family in 1817. How the voice spoke in different accents, moved objects, and eventually poisoned John Bell. How General Andrew Jackson himself investigated the haunting. They'll tell you it's one of America's best documented supernatural cases. What they won't tell you is that it's actually one of America's best documented cases of how communities choose their own version of history. How they decide which stories to remember and which people to forget. How they turn victims into villains and perpetrators into martyrs. How they make ghosts out of women who deserved justice. But those courthouse records are still there. Kate Batts's name is still in the legal documents. The land dispute that started everything is still documented in black and white. The evidence hasn't disappeared. It's just been ignored for so long that most people forgot it ever existed. And maybe that's exactly what someone wanted all along. Because the next section is going to show you something that changes everything we think we know about this case. Documents that were filed but never processed. Records that were kept but never catalogued. Evidence that suggests this story didn't end when John Bell died. It just went underground. The Robertson County Courthouse burned down in 1879. Convenient timing, you might say. 62 years after the Bell witch haunting ended, and suddenly all those property records, all those lawsuit documents, all those witness statements gone. But fires don't destroy everything, and people talk. What survived tells a different story than the one Richard Williams Bell wanted you to hear. The county clerk's office kept duplicate land records in Nashville. The Tennessee State Archives has probate files that somehow escaped the flames. Court reporters kept personal copies of testimony. And families, well, families remember things differently than ghost stories do. In 1943, a WPA worker named Margaret Lindsley was collecting oral histories in Robertson County. She interviewed descendants of families who'd lived through the Bell witch years, people who'd grown up hearing their grandparents' versions of events, versions that never made it into Richard Bell's book. The Batts family descendants told her Kate Batts never stopped fighting the land dispute. Right up until she died in 1840, she was filing appeals, demanding surveys, trying to get anyone to listen. She'd collected affidavits from neighbors who remembered the original boundary markers, sworn statements from men who'd helped survey the land before John Bell moved them. But here's what Margaret Lindsley noted in her field report, the part that should bother you. Every single person she interviewed asked her not to use their real names. In 1943, a century after the haunting, they were still afraid. The Bell family got rich off that ghost story, one descendant told her. Built their whole reputation on it, but my great-grandmother, she remembered Kate Batts different, said she was a fighter, not a witch. Said the sounds started right after John Bell moved those survey markers back where they belonged. Another family remembered something else. The Gunn descendants remember James Gunn was Kate Batts' brother-in-law. They kept records too, family Bible entries, letters between relatives. And according to their version, Kate Batts never lived alone in that cabin the way Richard Bell described her. She had help, lots of help. The Gunns had money, not Bell family money, but enough to hire their own surveyors, enough to keep lawyers on retainer, enough to make sure Kate Batts' side of the story got told in court, even if it never made it into the history books. And here's the part nobody wants to talk about. They won, not the haunting part, not the ghost story part, the legal part. In 1838, 21 years after the Bell witch supposedly left Adams forever, a circuit court judge ruled that John Bell had indeed moved boundary markers on the disputed land. The Batts family was awarded damages. Posthumous damages, since Kate had died 2 years earlier, but damages nonetheless. You know what's interesting about that court ruling? It was never appealed. The Bell family, who'd fought every legal challenge for decades, who'd spent fortunes on lawyers and surveyors and witnesses, they just accepted it, paid the judgment, moved on. Draw your own conclusions about why they suddenly stopped fighting a case they could have appealed all the way to the Tennessee Supreme Court. The WPA interviews reveal something else. Multiple families remembered a meeting. Winter of 1820, 3 years after the haunting ended. Kate Batts called together everyone who'd been harmed by the Bell family's land deals. Not just her case, all of them. The Gunns, the Johnsons, the Thorntons. Families who'd lost property, lost money, lost reputations. According to the stories passed down, they made a pact. They'd pool their resources, share information, support each other's legal challenges, and most importantly, they'd make sure the real story got preserved, even if the newspapers preferred the ghost version. Margaret Lindsley found something else in her interviews, a detail that never made it into Richard Bell's book but appeared in multiple family accounts. The Bell Witch's voice, that supernatural entity that knew everyone's secrets, it had an accent, a Scottish accent. Kate Batts was born in Scotland, immigrated to Tennessee as a young woman. Her descendants remembered her speaking with a thick brogue her entire life, especially when she was angry. And according to the families Margaret Lindsley interviewed, the Bell Witch's voice sounded exactly like Kate Batts when she was furious. But here's the part that should really bother you. Richard Bell knew this. His book mentions Kate Batts' Scottish heritage. He describes her accent in several passages, but somehow when he's describing the Bell Witch's voice, that detail disappears. The supernatural entity speaks perfect English, no accent mentioned at all. Nobody ever asked why. You know, if you're still listening at this point, you're one of us. Hit subscribe. We uncover a new American mystery every single night. The Tennessee State Archives has one more document that's worth mentioning. A letter from Kate Batts to her sister in Scotland, dated 1835. 5 years before Kate died. She's writing about the Bell family, about the land dispute, about the years of legal battles. And at the end of the letter, she writes something that should give you chills. They made me into their monster sister, turned my fight for justice into their ghost story. But the truth has a way of surviving, even when they try to bury it. The letter was donated to the archives in 1963 by Kate Batts' great-niece. She'd kept it in her family for over a century, waiting for someone who might understand its significance. By then, the Bell Witch was already a tourist attraction. Gift shops sold Bell Witch souvenirs. Tour guides led visitors through the caves where it all supposedly started. But that letter tells a different story. The story of a woman who fought a system designed to silence her, who used every tool at her disposal to get justice, and who watched helplessly as her enemies turned her rebellion into their profit. The great-niece who donated the letter included a note with her donation. She wrote, "My family kept this to remind us that Kate Batts was not a witch. She was a woman who refused to be stolen from. The Bell family made her famous for all the wrong reasons." The Robertson County Historical Society has tried to get access to the remaining Bell family papers multiple times. The family still owns them, still keeps them private, still refuses to let historians examine the documents that might shed more light on what really happened in Adams, Tennessee. When asked why, the current Bell family spokesperson gave the same answer they've been giving for decades. Some stories are better left as mysteries. But mysteries have a way of solving themselves, don't they? Documents surface, families talk, archives preserve what powerful people try to destroy. And sometimes, late at night, when you're digging through old records and forgotten testimonies, you realize the real ghost story isn't about supernatural revenge. It's about how the powerful write history to make their victims disappear. You want to know why the Bell Witch story survived when thousands of other frontier ghost tales died with the people who told them? It wasn't because it was true, it was because it was useful. Richard Williams Bell published his manuscript in 1894. By then, most of the people who could contradict his version were dead. Kate Batts had been in her grave for 15 years. The neighbors who witnessed the real family drama, gone. The court clerks who filed the property disputes, buried alongside their inconvenient records. But here's what Richard understood that modern marketing executives would recognize immediately. People don't want the truth. They want a story that confirms what they already believe about the world. The Bell Witch story gave America exactly what it needed in 1894. The frontier was closing. The wild, dangerous days were becoming nostalgic. People in cities wanted to believe that the wilderness had been full of genuine mystery, not just poverty and property disputes. Richard's timing was perfect. The spiritualist movement was at its peak. Seances were fashionable in parlors from Nashville to New York. Ghost stories weren't superstition anymore, they were sophisticated entertainment for people who considered themselves modern. And Richard Bell had the best ghost story of all. Not some vague apparition or mysterious noise. A talking spirit with a personality. A ghost with opinions. A supernatural entity that could hold conversations and make predictions. But why this particular story? Why did the Bell Witch survive when the ghost of Mammoth Cave didn't? When the haunted house of Lebanon faded into local folklore? Because Richard Bell understood something about American mythology that most people miss. The best stories aren't the ones that happened. They're the ones that should have happened. Americans in 1894 wanted to believe that the frontier had been a place where impossible things occurred, where the rules of civilization didn't apply, where a wronged woman could reach beyond death itself to claim justice. The Bell Witch story worked because it felt like karma. John Bell was greedy. He cheated a widow. He got what was coming to him. That's not history, that's moral universe thinking. That's the kind of story people tell their children to teach them lessons about fairness. And once Richard's book found its audience, something else happened. Tourism. By 1900, people were taking the train down from Nashville to see the Bell Farm. Local guides were charging 50 cents to show visitors the cave where it all started. The property that John Bell had died trying to keep in the family became the family's salvation again. Hotels in nearby Springfield started advertising Bell Witch Country. Restaurants served witches brew coffee. Gift shops sold authentic Bell Farm souvenirs, most of them made in Nashville. The story spread because it had everything: mystery, injustice, revenge, a beautiful young victim, a villain who got his comeuppance, and best of all, it was supposedly true. Newspapers picked it up. Ministers used it in sermons about divine justice. Traveling lecturers included it in their programs about mysteries of the American frontier. Each telling added new details. The ghost became more articulate. The phenomena became more spectacular. The moral became more clear-cut. By 1920, the Bell Witch wasn't just a ghost story. It was American folklore. It was the kind of tale that proved America was a land where even the supernatural operated according to principles of justice and retribution. But here's what nobody talks about. The story survived because it erased Kate Batts. Think about it. In Richard Bell's version, the witch is a supernatural force, an entity, a presence. It's not a specific woman with a specific grievance and a specific legal case. Kate Batts becomes the witch. Her legitimate property claims become supernatural harassment. Her financial ruin becomes otherworldly justice. Her death in poverty becomes the triumphant departure of a vengeful spirit. The real woman disappears. The ghost story remains. And that's why this story survived when others didn't. Because it took a messy, complicated human situation, a property dispute, a family's financial problems, a community's willingness to scapegoat a difficult woman and turned it into a clean moral tale. In the Bell Witch story, good eventually triumphs. The family suffers but survives. The evil force is defeated. Justice is served. That's not what happened in Adams, Tennessee between 1817 and 1821. What happened was much more human, much more ordinary, much more disturbing. A wealthy man cheated a widow out of her property. When she fought back through legal channels, the community turned against her. A family used supernatural claims to deflect attention from their financial crimes. A woman died alone and forgotten while her accusers became local celebrities. That's the story. That's what really happened. But that story doesn't sell books. It doesn't bring tourists to Tennessee. It doesn't confirm people's beliefs about cosmic justice and supernatural intervention. So the Bell Witch story survived, and Kate Batt's story was buried with her. The question isn't why people believed in the Bell Witch. The question is why they needed to believe in her. What does it say about us that we prefer the ghost story to the human one? And here's what should really bother you. We're still doing it. Every time someone tells the Bell Witch story without mentioning Kate Batt's lawsuit. Every time a documentary focuses on the supernatural claims without examining the property records. Every time we choose the legend over the evidence. We're participating in the same cover-up that started 200 years ago in a Tennessee courtroom. But there's one voice that history tried to silence. One perspective that Richard Bell's manuscript couldn't erase completely. And in our final section, we're going to let her speak. What would Kate Batt say about her legacy? What would she think about becoming America's most famous witch? Here's what gets me about Kate Batt. She died in 1850, nearly 30 years after the Bell Witch haunting made her the most hated woman in Robertson County. 30 years of watching her neighbors profit from a story that painted her as a vengeful witch. 30 years of seeing her legitimate grievances twisted into supernatural nonsense. And she never got to tell her side. But what if she could? What if Kate Batt could see how her story ended up? What would she say about the legend that bears her name but erases her humanity? First, she'd probably laugh. The bitter kind of laugh you get when you've been proven right in the worst possible way. She spent decades telling anyone who'd listened that the Bell family were thieves and liars, that John Bell had cheated her out of land that rightfully belonged to her family, that the whole haunting was an elaborate performance designed to discredit her lawsuit and paint her as crazy. Nobody believed her then, but now you know she was right. The Bell family did steal her land. They did orchestrate the haunting. They did use her reputation as a difficult woman to make her the villain in their ghost story. Kate Batt called it from the beginning. She just didn't have a ghost writer in the family to make sure history remembered her version. But here's what would probably surprise her most: how completely the Bell family succeeded in erasing her from her own story. When tourists visit the Bell Witch Cave today, they hear about a mysterious entity that tormented an innocent family. They don't hear about a widow fighting for her inheritance. They don't learn her name, her history, or her legitimate grievances. Kate Batt became the Bell Witch. Her identity was consumed by their fiction. Think about that for a second. A real woman with real problems became a supernatural villain in someone else's story. Her pain, her loss, her desperate fight for justice, all of it transformed into entertainment. Her name attached to a legend that portrays her as evil incarnate. She'd be amazed by how profitable her suffering became. The Bell family sold their story to newspapers, magazines, and eventually book publishers. Richard Bell made a career out of his ghost story. The cave on their property became a tourist destination. People paid money to hear about the witch who tormented the innocent Bells. Meanwhile, Kate Batts died poor and forgotten. The woman whose stolen land made the whole story possible never saw a penny from its telling. But I think what would hurt her most is how the story rewrote the narrative of women's power. The Bell Witch legend suggests that when women get angry, when they demand justice, when they refuse to be silent, they become supernatural threats. Dangerous, evil, witchy. Kate Batts wasn't a witch. She was a woman who got cheated and fought back. She was a neighbor who wouldn't let theft slide just because it was committed by a prominent family. She was a widow who understood that her only power came from her willingness to make noise, to file lawsuits, to be inconvenient. The Bell family turned that strength into a ghost story. They made her power literal, supernatural, and therefore dismissible. Real women don't have that kind of power, the story suggests. Only witches do. Now here's the part that should really bother you. This pattern didn't end with Kate Batts. How many women throughout American history have been labeled difficult, crazy, or witchy simply for demanding what was theirs? How many legitimate grievances have been reframed as supernatural revenge? Every time someone visits that cave and hears about the Bell Witch, they're participating in Kate Batts' erasure. They're buying into a version of events that was deliberately crafted to hide a crime. They're treating a woman's stolen inheritance as entertainment. The tour guides don't mention the lawsuit. They don't explain the land dispute. They don't tell you that the witch was a real person with a real name who died in poverty while her story made other people rich. But maybe Kate Batts would find some satisfaction in knowing that the truth survived, that the documents are still there in the courthouse, that her lawsuit is still on record, that someone eventually bothered to look past the ghost story and find the woman underneath. She'd probably be surprised that it took this long, nearly 2 centuries, for someone to connect the dots, to realize that the Bell Witch and Kate Batts were the same person, to understand that the haunting was really just a very elaborate cover-up. But then again, maybe she wouldn't be surprised at all. Kate Batts knew how these things worked. She knew that powerful families protect themselves. She knew that difficult women get written out of their own stories. She knew that when you're fighting people with money and influence, the truth has a way of getting buried. What she probably couldn't have predicted is how completely her identity would be consumed by their fiction. Kate Batts, the person, disappeared. The Bell Witch, the legend, lived forever. That's the real tragedy here, not the haunting, not the supernatural revenge. The tragedy is that a woman's fight for justice became someone else's ghost story. Her pain became their prophet. Her name became their monster. Kate Batts deserved better. She deserved to have her story told honestly. She deserved to be remembered as what she was, not a witch, but a woman who wouldn't be silenced. Instead, she became America's most famous ghost. The Bell Witch haunting is taught in folklore classes, featured in documentaries, and retold in countless books and movies. Her story, or rather their version of her story, has reached millions of people. But until now, almost none of them knew her real name. So here's Kate Batts' legacy. She proved that when you steal from the wrong woman, the consequences can echo for centuries. Maybe not in the supernatural way the Bell family claimed, but in ways that matter more. Truth has a way of surfacing eventually. Justice may be delayed, but it's rarely denied forever. The Bell family got their ghost story. Kate Batts gets the last word. That's the story, or at least, that's the version that survived. Somewhere in those Tennessee hills, Kate Batts is buried in an unmarked grave, her real story finally told after 2 centuries of silence. If you made it this far, you're the kind of person this channel was made for. We go deep on a different American mystery every night. Subscribe and I'll see you tomorrow. And hey, tell me in the comments, do you think Kate Batts ever really believed the Bell family would get away with it? I want to hear your theory. Sleep well.